What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was banished and returned leading an army against Konoha? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. It was a pleasantly beautiful day in the land of fire, and like every nice, and even not so nice, day, there was a mission being undertaken by ninjas from the Hidden Leaf village. There were 4 ninja in total on this mission. The oldest, and commander of this group, was a woman of exceptional beauty. She was dressed in a red, mesh armor blouse with what seemed to be white medical tape over top of it. The blouse had only one sleeve on the right side, and her arms and legs were wrapped in white medical tape. Her black, unruly, shoulder-length hair was kept out of her eyes by her Hite-8, which allowed others to see her unusual, but still beautiful, red eyes. This ninja's name was Kurenai Yuhi, Junin and Genjutsu specialist of Konoha. How much Lungier? A young female voice rang out, shattering the peace and quiet of the forest. Kurenai looked over at the young girl and had to hold back a laugh at her fellow kunoichi's tone. We're almost there, Ino, just another hour or so and we'll be at the bridge to Wave Country. Ino Yamanaka was the second member of this unusual quartet. She was a fair-skinned girl with shoulder-length, platinum blonde hair that was tied back in a ponytail. However, a single bang stuck out and shadowed one of her deep, blue eyes. She wore a purple, vest-like blouse with a raised collar that stopped above her belly button. She also wore a purple, apron skirt with slits down the sides. Her stomach and legs were wrapped in white medical tape while her arms were sheathed in purple and white elbow warmers. Her Hite-8 was worn like a belt. But I'm getting bored, sensei, I still don't see why we couldn't just run there. Ino stated before crossing her arms and pouting. This brought a tired side to Kurenai's lips, but before she could voice the reasoning behind her decision again, the third member of their squad spoke out. We're walking B because this is just a diplomatic V visit to Wave Country, Ino, and T there's no real rush to complete it, okay? That's right, Hinata, there's no actual hurry to complete this mission, so we're taking it slow and giving ourselves time to relax. With that being said, Kurenai turned to her surrogate younger sister and smiled, happy that at least one member of the team paid attention to her instructions. Hinata Hyuga was the third member of this team. She had short, dark blue hair in a Heim-cut style and 2 chin-length strands framing her face. Her skin was the fairest of all 3 kunoichi on the team and held an almost ethereal glow to it. She was dressed in a baggy, cream-colored coat with fur lining the waist. She also wore plum-colored pants that reached to below her knees. Her most prominent feature were her eyes. Like her commanding officer, they too were an unusual color. They were lavender, like a set of pearls. This was because she came from the Hyuga clan, which was home to the famous bloodline the Byakugan. Her Hite-8 was worn around her neck. Well, of course Hinata has no problem taking her time, Ino began in a teasing tone of voice. She'd do anything to make this mission last as long as possible, ha ha ha. Ino giggled quietly behind her hand at Hinata's mortified look. She couldn't believe her friend would be so careless with her secret. Especially with said secret walking just 20 steps ahead of them. Hinata quickly looked ahead of her, and then sighed in relief when she saw that her not-so-secret love had remained in deep thought and hadn't heard Ino's teasing. This fourth and final member of the team was the lone male of the squad. His name was Naruto Uzumaki. This young boy had a head of wild, spiky blonde hair and a pair of deep, ocean blue eyes. His hair was also kept out of his eyes by his Hite-8. He wore an orange jumpsuit, with blue trim around the shoulders and waist, and a raised collar. His most prominent feature known to most were his 6 whisker marks, 3 on each cheek. Right now Naruto had his arms crossed behind his head and his eyes turned to the sky in deep thought. Ever since the Hokage had assigned this mission, the young Uzumaki had felt a sense of anxiousness. He had a feeling that this trip would lead to something life-changing for him and, quite possibly, even the elemental nations themselves. He had no idea just how right he was. Like Kurenai said, they arrived at the bridge within the hour and were greeted by a shocking discovery. The bridge was a magnificent structure, a true testament to Mont's ability to sculpt something out of seemingly nothing. Its size alone baffled the 3 kunoichi's minds, but add to it the archways that had been built across the tops at 50-yard intervals, and were managing to keep themselves from collapsing under their own weight despite the distance between the left and right sides of the bridge. The Great Naruto Bridge was a masterpiece. Naruto, who had been present for the bridge's completion, wasn't blown away by its splendor, but was shocked when he noticed the new additions to the bridge. There, on either side of the entrance, stood two generously sized statues of Naruto. The statues depicted the young blonde with his arms crossed in front of his chest and a smirk on his lips, the same smirk he gave when he'd battled Zabuza the first time around. The likeness was uncanny, almost as if the statues were about to breathe life and step off their pedestals, which Naruto realized had an engraving on them, in language he'd never seen before. It read, Vicimus. Once the other three members of his diplomatic envoy were able to draw their eyes away from the side of the bridge, they were once again stunned at the sight of the statues that greeted all who passed by this way. One member in particular's shock swiftly turned to joy. Hinata had been left in awe of the Great Naruto Bridge. When she'd first learned that her Naruto-kun had gotten a bridge named after him, she'd been so proud of him, as well as elated that there was an entire country that recognized what a special person her love was. And now, that she got to see the bridge in person, she felt her heart swell once again with pride and happiness for her Naruto-kun. When she finally managed to pull her eyes away from the bridge, and was about to congratulate him on his tremendous accomplishment, she noticed that he was staring at something. A statue of himself. Hinata once again marveled at the people of Wave's crafting ability, but before she could lose herself in the beauty of the work, she heard Naruto say the word, Vicimus, in a curious tone. Deciding to, hopefully, score some points with him, Hinata answered Naruto's unspoken question. Vicimus means, victory is ours, Naruto-kun. Why you're having trouble reading and you understanding it because it's in a different language, Latin to be exact. Latin? How come I've never heard of it before? Naruto asked curiously. He hoped it wasn't one of the lessons he was forced to miss due to teachers kicking him out of class. He didn't want to look stupid in front of either Hinata or Ino. After the incident at the hospital, when he brought Tsunade back to heal Sasuke and Kakashi-sensei, Naruto's feelings for Sakura had begun to lose their intensity. He was looking to other girls to find a love interest, and these two girls were at the top of his list. He'd always considered Ino to be a beautiful girl, more so than Sakura. If he were being true to himself, she could be just as smart as her at times too. Hinata was a girl he'd never really noticed at the academy, but that didn't mean he didn't know she existed. He knew she was just as smart as Sakura, and she was also the nicest person he'd ever met. She had a way about her, something Naruto had been noticing the past month, that just made him want to hold her close to him and not let go. He chalked it up to her, admittedly, adorable innocence and partial naivety. Thankfully, his fears were quickly laid to rest. Come to think of it, I've never heard of it either, Hinata. How come you know about this language but we don't? Ino asked in surprise. Hinata, now with 3 sets of eyes on her, with the inclusion of her sensei, began to feel the heat rise in her cheeks and her hands subconsciously coming up to push her index fingers together out of habit. Well, Ino-chan. The reason I know about it is because as daughter to the head of the Hyuga clan I'm supposed to be well versed in all things, including history. I learned about what the world was like before ninjas existed and learned that many people spoke the language of Latin for a time before it died out. All 3 of her companions were impressed with the young girl's ability to memorize the many things she was tasked with learning, and then being able to just pull that knowledge out at random. It was an invaluable skill for a ninja to have. Thanks, Hinata. I wasn't sure if they'd covered that in the academy or not. Now I don't feel as dumb, knowing that it was something most people don't know. You must be smart to be able to remember all the things those tutors you had taught you. Naruto exclaimed with gratitude that turned to impressed awe near the end. Naruto's compliment caused the young heiress to duck her head so as not to show off her reddening face. Luckily, Hinata was saved from a possible fainting spell by her sensei. Yes, thank you, Hinata. Now if we're all done asking questions, let's continue on to the town and find a place to stay for the trip. Then, we'll begin conducting our business. And with that the quartet began its trek towards the village. But with every step he took, Naruto could feel the knot in his stomach grow tighter and tighter, and all he could think was, why do I get the feeling that after this trip, nothing will ever be the same? It didn't take them long to make it across the bridge and into the village, and once there they made it a point to find a place to stay for their trip. As they waked through the town, the females of the team noticed all the different looks Naruto seemed to be getting. They ranged from pleasant smiles to flirtatious looks. These Hinata didn't appreciate, and the young Uzumaki seemed oblivious too. Just as they had found a suitable hotel to stay in, they heard a voice call out to them. "Hey Naruto, is that you?" At the sound of his name, the blonde turned his head and was met with the sight of Tazuna, the master bridge builder. "Hey old man, whoa, what's with the nice clothes?" Naruto had noticed that Tazuna was dressed in a fairly nice, royal purple pallium draped over pristine, white robes. "Haha, Naruto my boy, it's great to see you again. As for the clothes, they were given to me after I was elected as a member of our senate." Naruto threw a confused look at the man and asked, "What's a senate?" Before Tazuna could answer, Hinata once again stepped forward with her knowledge of ancient times. The senate is much like our government, Naruto-kun. They oversee the rules and regulations of the land they govern. Tazuna looked to the young Hyuga with a gleam of respect in his eye as he rebutted. "It's nice to meet someone with knowledge of the ancient customs. But you're only partially correct. The Senate technically has no official say in how the city, state or country is run. That's actually left up to the councils, we just get to give advice." Naruto nodded his head in understanding before asking, "Did they have a Hokage then too? I mean, since they seemed to have a multi-level government like us, did they have a single leader at the top of it all?" This time it was Tazuna who spoke first. As a matter of fact, there were times where the Senate would grant a single man the title of dictator and give him, essentially, total control over the city. "In fact, this reminds me of what I was searching for you for, Naruto." Before Naruto could ask why he was being sought out, his fellow blonde decided to voice her displeasure at being forced to stay on her feet, after being promised time to rest. Yeah, can the two of you wait until we all get a chance to settle down before continuing this fascinating conversation? I'm tired." It was after this that the fourth, and leader of their little group, decided that her young charge was correct. "Ino makes a valid point, Naruto. You'll have all the time you want on this mission to ask Tazuna questions. For now the rest of us would like to relax after that long walk." Naruto balked at this. "But Kurenai-sensei, you were the one who said that walking here would be relaxing for us. Why are you complaining about being tired now?" Kurenai felt the heat crawling up her neck at the genin's true words and thought, "Damn it Kakashi, you told me that Naruto was oblivious, so what's with this?" Quickly trying to save face, the Junin quickly cleared her throat before speaking. "Ahem, well, Naruto, I was speaking for Hinata and Ino's sakes. They're probably sore from all the walking and wish to sit down at the very least, don't you think?" Naruto's eyes gained a disbelieving light to them but was kept from responding again, this time by Tazuna. "Well, there's no problem with that. Why don't the four of you come back with me to my home and my daughter Tsunami can cook us up something to eat while Naruto and I continue our, how did you put it, Blondie, fascinating conversation, ha ha ha." Seeing no reason to decline, Kurenai quickly thanked the man for his offer, and then she and her team followed behind the man back to his home. It took them about another half hour to reach Tazuna's home, and when they did, it wasn't the same house Naruto remembered from his last visit. Instead of a shoddy, wooden two-story home, they were met with a building made of stone. It was a two-story building like its predecessor, but this new house was equipped with a burnt red-orange awning in the front that was being held up by red and white columns. The doorways were made from a rich, heavy, dark brown oak wood. The second story had a balcony that was surrounded by a wooden fence, no doubt the same strong wood the doors were made of. They could tell that the floor of the balcony was a system of large decorative stones spaced out through the cement binding. Windows were placed at the front. They could see at least one on the left side of the home, as well as two on the second story that they could see. The base of the home also had a red trim around it. "Welcome to my home. It's gotten an upgrade since you've last seen it, huh, Naruto?" Said Blonde could only nod his head in agreement. "Well, enough standing around, let's get inside so your friends can rest and I can tell you what I wanted to talk to you about." Once inside they were greeted by Tsunami, who was already in the process of making dinner. "It'll take a little more time now since I have to make more food for the rest of you. I hope you don't mind waiting, I just wasn't aware you'd be arriving today." Hinata quickly volunteered to help with the meal, her mind once again set on gaining a positive reaction from Naruto, while Ino let everyone know she was going to lay down on the couch and take a nap. "So, Naruto, how about we go into my study so I can explain why I asked for you specifically on this mission, and why I was searching for you in the village earlier." Naruto looked over to the old bridge builder and he once again felt that feeling of anxiousness well up in the pit of his stomach. What's the big deal? He's probably just gonna tell me about how much better off Wave's been since Gato was taken out. With that thought in mind, he nodded his head and followed Tazuna to his study. Kurenai watched the two males walk off with a calculating stare. She couldn't help the curiosity that stemmed from wanting to know what Tazuna had wanted to share with just Naruto specifically. But before she could ponder it any further, Hinata called her over to taste test the soup she'd made. Knowing how badly Hinata wanted dinner to turn out perfect, Kurenai pushed Tazuna and his strange request to the back of her mind and went to assist her lovesick, though sometimes overly devoted, student. I just hope it doesn't become a problem. Naruto sat, listening intently as Tazuna regaled him with stories of the world before there were ninja. So entranced was he, that he almost missed when the master bridge builder began to speak about the history of Wave specifically. Wave Country was once part of a vast empire that stretched across much of the elemental nations and even lands to the west of them. That wall that separates the east and west continents was built by one of the last rulers of that empire. His name was Hadrian. He built it because he felt that the empire had increased to an almost unmanageable size, and to extend it any further would lead to its collapse. Unfortunately, the collapse was inevitable as all the truly great leaders of the empire had already passed on. Their greatest having been assassinated actually. At this Naruto had to stop and ask. But if he was their greatest leader, why did they assassinate him? Tazuna looked the young shinobi right in the eyes, and spoke only one word: fear. This only confused Naruto more. What do you mean fear, old man? The people loved him, so what did they have to be afraid of? The older man couldn't help but chuckle before answering. It wasn't the people that feared him, Naruto, it was his comrades in office that feared and despised him. They felt this way because of his position as dictator. The senators believed that he had taken their power away from them. Power the Senate felt rightly belonged to them. Naruto's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, as he thought about how the same thing that happened to this ancient dictator could happen to him if he were to become Hokage of the Leaf Village. He lifted his head and looked Tazuna in the eye before asking. What was the mont's name? Tazuna? The blonde couldn't fail to notice the smile that made its way onto the older mont's face, nor the spark in his eye as he said. Now Naruto, that's just the question I was waiting to hear from you. Tell me, have you ever heard the name Julius Caesar? The knot that had been forming in Naruto's stomach pulled even tighter at the sound of that name. Caesar. Can you, know, tell me about him? Caesar, I mean. Naruto sat, literally, on the edge of his seat waiting for Tazuna to tell him of the legendary leader. After learning that this guy ruled over such a large empire, Naruto found himself needing to learn more about him. At the sound of the name, Caesar, Naruto began to hear a whisper in the back of his brain. Knowledge is power. Learn more and watch all the doors that open up for you. Ha ha ha, of course I'll tell you, kid. After all, he is the greatest man in Roman history. At this Naruto cocked his head in confusion. Rome? What's that, Tazuna? Rome was the name of the empire, Naruto. It started with the city-state of Rome, which later became the now deserted Whirlpool, and expanded from there to this. At that moment he unrolled a map he had on the table. On the map was the entire elemental nations, as well as the continents to the west. The color code to the map was mostly crimson in color, with specks of just the tan of the map littered here and there, and a forest green beginning in the west where the red stopped. Every bit of red you see was included in the Roman Empire. The uncolored specks were neutral city-states, and the green patch that starts here in the west was the unconquered, barbarian lands. Naruto wasn't sure what to make of this. How could one little city-state be the head of such a vast empire? But, how did it get so big? How did Rome manage to cover so much land? The young genin had this gnawing curiosity eating away at him. He wanted to know more. He needed to know more. And Tazuna was all too happy to share his knowledge with him. Well, obviously Rome wasn't built in a day, Naruto. First, they conquered their neighbors. Then, once those people were added to the population, the size of the army increased as well, giving them an easier time conquering other smaller city-states until they had a large enough force to overcome bigger groups of people. It's a domino effect, Naruto. With his curiosity about the empire itself quelled for the moment, Naruto returned them to the main topic he wished to discuss. Okay, that makes sense. So did Caesar rule over all of this? This time Tazuna let out a disheartened sigh. Unfortunately, no, he didn't. Caesar was assassinated long before the empire ever reached the height of its expansion. However, I have no doubt that, had he not been murdered, he would have brought the empire to its height much faster than those rulers who followed after him and even been able to keep it from falling apart. The young blonde could feel the waves of sadness as Tazuna spoke about the murder of the great dictator. So what kind of person was Caesar, old man? He sounds pretty great from what you're telling me. Well, he was considered a master public speaker, one of the greatest in Rome's history. Julius Caesar could make you do what he thought you should do by giving you a speech. Caesar was also a military genius. He thought of every conceivable advantage while on and off the field of battle, and always made sure that his enemies would be at a disadvantage in responding to him. He was brilliant in his ability to relate to people and make them like him. He could be friendly with his ordinary soldiers, because he was in battle with them and showed that he had just as much guts and as much stamina as they did. Julius Caesar was considered by many to be the greatest Roman in history. Young Naruto was completely captivated by Tazuna's description of Caesar. The only other person he'd ever heard anything close to such praise for was his village's fourth Hokage, and even he wasn't elevated to the status of greatest citizen in history. However, before Naruto could ask any more about the great general, a call of "dinner's ready" pulled the two males from their conversation. As Naruto got up from his seat to leave, he was stopped by a hand on his arm. Looking back, he saw Tazuna with a strange light in his eye. He looks like he knows something I don't, then again this whole afternoon's been filled with learning new things. Naruto lifted an eyebrow in confusion before Tazuna answered his silent question. Naruto, there's some ruins on the far end of the village that I think you'd be interested in seeing. If you'd like, I can draw you a map so that you can find your way there. There's some things there that I'm sure you'd like to see. Naruto's eyes lit up and he swiftly nodded his head, yes. As they all sat down for dinner, there was only light conversation between Tsunami and Hinata, as well as Naruto and the newly arrived Inari, Tazuna's grandson. While Naruto and the young fisherman chatted away, both were oblivious to a set of red eyes upon them. Kurenai had managed to push her curiosity to the back of her mind while she helped Hinata with her stew, but upon seeing Naruto and Tazuna exit the study after over 2 hours of talking, she couldn't stop herself from, once again, wondering about just what the two males had been talking about for so long. What could the two of them honestly have been talking about for so long? There's no way they were just catching up, not with the look they both have in their eye. So, Naruto, how was catching up with Tazuna-san? She was hoping she could trip the young blonde up, and get him to reveal some of what the two of them had talked about. Kakashi did say that Naruto was easy to trip up, I just had to ask the right questions. Naruto, as a matter of fact, was about to tell the Junin what he and Tazuna had spoke about, but before he opened his mouth, the voice in the back of his head whispered to him, "Don't tell her about what you've learned. She may try to go with you to the ruins tomorrow, and you don't want that. If she goes, she'll report them to Tsunade, and that could lead to more snooping around. Make something up and leave out everything you've learned today. Remember, knowledge is power, and for too long you've been without power. Don't you think it's time you had some?" Agreeing with the voice, and deciding he liked the idea of having power, Naruto went on to tell Kurenai that they had spoken of what the two of them had been up to at first, but after running out new experiences to share, the two males simply spoke about how much better off the village seemed, and Tazuna had even explained the shipping business to Naruto. "Well, that's nice. I remember Tazuna-san had something important to tell you. Did you two get a chance to discuss it?" Kurenai hoped that Naruto wouldn't read too much into her curiosity. She didn't realize Naruto had already caught on to her game. "Unfortunately, Kurenai-sensei, we didn't. I was so caught up in Tazuna's explanation of how the shipping business works that I'd forgotten to ask him. This wasn't enough for the Genjutsu mistress. That is unfortunate. Tazuna-san, why don't you tell Naruto now so you don't run the risk of forgetting again?" At the end, she threw a small smile at the bridge builder, in the hopes to disarm any hesitation he might have about speaking of the topic in front of others. "But sensei," Naruto cut in, "does that seem right? Tazuna said he had something he wanted to discuss with me, not the rest of the household. Think about it, if you were given documents to deliver and were told they were meant for the receiver's eyes only, would you look inside?" With this, Kurenai had been essentially disarmed of any further questions she might have asked, because she knew that if she were to keep up her questions, then she would lose face with not only her students, but also with a foreign business prospect. Damn it, Naruto might not be as naive as Kakashi says he is. That move just shut down any argument I might have made to get Tazuna to talk. With that, dinner became a quiet affair. Even the usually talkative Ino was silent after hearing Naruto of all people basically dress down a Junin. Then, in an effort to break the silence, Naruto complimented the food. "Tsunami, everything tastes great. The fish is grilled to perfection and this stew is amazing. I've never eaten any this good before." At hearing Naruto's compliment, Hinata's cheeks took on a light pink hue, that only darkened to a shade of red when Tsunami pointed out, "Actually Naruto, I didn't make the stew, your teammate did." She smiled over in Hinata's direction, which made Naruto realize the woman was referring to her. "Hinata, you made this?" The Hyuga heiress nodded shyly while keeping her eyes on her own plate. "Wow, I was serious, this has got to be the best stew I've ever had." Naruto was unaware the effect his words were having on the young girl sitting at the table with him. "Naruto-kun likes it, I did good." Hinata had been worried that she had missed something or that she'd added too much of another ingredient, but to hear Naruto say it was the best he'd ever had made her face burn a fiery red and her heart to feel ready to burst. Unfortunately, her bliss would soon turn to embarrassment, as Ino seemed to find her voice again. "Well, it better be good, since Hinata wouldn't move more than 2 steps from it. And when I told her that I thought it needed more of something, she'd get all fidgety and wouldn't leave me alone until I said it tasted perfect. Not fine, or okay, but perfect." Ino finished off her retort by throwing a shark-like grin at her fellow kunoichi, finding enjoyment out of teasing her about her devotion to the blonde boy at the head of the table. "Well, it worked, this turned out great. Hinata, you're gonna make some guy really happy one day." Yawn. "Well, I'm gonna go to bed a little early. I guess all that walking tired me out more than I thought." As Naruto got up to leave, he threw a glance to Tazuna and slightly nodded his head. As Naruto was exiting the kitchen, he failed to notice 2 sets of eyes on him. Hinata's eyes felt like they were going to explode out of her head at the compliment given to her by her Naruto-kun. She desperately wanted to tell him that his happiness was the only one she cared about, that he was the only guy she wanted to stand beside. Or kneel down in front of, a voice whispered in her mind, causing her face to erupt in a crimson flare as her eyes followed her blonde out the door until he couldn't be seen anymore. Another set of eyes watched Naruto as he got up and left the room. However, this pair wasn't filled with love and boundless devotion, but with curiosity and suspicion. She'd always been led to believe that Naruto was a joker and not someone you'd take seriously in an argument. But with what she'd seen today, she decided that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Naruto Uzumaki than meets the eye. Naruto sat on the side of his bed, seemingly just staring at the wall, but really, he was in deep thought. "Tazuna said that I'd be specifically interested in the ruins, but I wonder why. What could they hold that would interest just me?" Before Naruto could ponder this any further, the voice in his head spoke out. "Why worry so much about the why? Instead, revel in the fact that you, and you alone, will be going to see the treasures these ruins seem to hold. Tazuna wouldn't send you there if he didn't think it important or helpful to you in some way, right?" With that, Naruto was once again left to the silence of the room, and alone with his thoughts. Suddenly it became clear to the blonde that the voice he'd been hearing in his head was his own. It was his mind divulging the wisdom he'd been receiving over the last few hours. With the comforting thought that he might just be more clever than others gave him credit for, and a new sense of delightful anticipation at visiting the ruins tomorrow, Naruto lay back on his bed and drifted off to sleep. Dream. Naruto found himself, oddly enough, sitting atop the front gate of his village. Sure, he'd sat up here before finding out about the great view on the Hokage monument, but he couldn't think of why he'd be there now. But before he could question it any further, Naruto heard what sounded like a horn, echoing from a distance. Normally he'd have dismissed this as his ears playing tricks on him, but then he heard it again, and there it was again. All until he heard the entire song being sung by those horns. And then that's when he saw it. A large group, an army by the looks of it, was marching down the dirt road to the gate of the Hidden Leaf village. The men were arranged in what seemed like squares, each one following the one in front of it. He could see the ever-blowing trumpeters at the front of the line, keeping in step with the soldiers in the front line. Naruto couldn't very well see what these soldiers wore, since their bodies were covered by their massive shields. but he could see that they wore metal shin guards on their legs and what looked to be leather shoes. On their heads they wore helmets unlike any Naruto had seen before. The helmets seemed to be skullcaps, with metal faceplates attached to guard the sides of the wearer's face, and Naruto could just make out a piece in the back that looked to be meant as protection for the back of the neck. The helmets were silver in color, with gold trim lining the cheek plates and the edge of the skullcap. There were also golden circles, 3 on each cheek plate and 2 on either side of the skullcap. Further back, Naruto observed that there were other soldiers that were dressed differently from these frontline soldiers. He could see some soldiers had plate armor, silver, metal plates stacked on top of each other and tied at the back by leather straps. These men also wore what seemed like scarves around their necks, probably to avoid chafing. Naruto thought before continuing his observations. He noticed that the soldiers had a short sword at their waist, the scabbard strap slung over their shoulders, and a slightly shorter blade fitted to the opposite side of their waist. Naruto could see that around their waists the men wore leather skirts around their waist? Teruges, his mind corrected him. These leather strips at times were studded with metal caps for added protection. On their feet they too wore metal greaves and leather shoes. These men had helmets in similar fashion to the ones in the front line. A small dot of red out of the corner of his eye caught Naruto's attention next. This man had a red streak of horsehair going across the top of his helmet horizontally. He also had a red cloak hanging from just his right shoulder. Naruto saw another soldier with these additions and noticed that, while most men wore the plated armor, some of these men had different styles of armor. Some had what seemed like metal scales peeking out from over their tunic, others had chainmail. Some men wore the plated armor, while others had armor that looked like muscle. Cuirass. Naruto's mind informed him again. Naruto summarized that these differences in armor were used to separate rank, and to make sure that everyone could plainly see this separation. The neighing of a horse drew Naruto's attention back to the front of the march, and he noticed for the first time men riding, and leading the other men, on horseback. He noticed that these soldiers had silver cuirass that allowed the shoulders of their blood-red tunics to show through. These were covered by red leather strips as well, just as their waists were covered. Like the other soldiers, these men had metal shin guards and leather shoes, though he could tell that the metal being used for these men's armor was of higher quality than the other soldiers. These men also wore blood-red capes that, instead of hanging from their shoulders, seemed to wrap around the neck and flow outward from there. These soldiers' helmets were also different. Instead of being made from multiple attachments, theirs was one single piece of metal. It still remained able to protect the neck and face, but didn't run the risk of having a piece be damaged and fall apart. The helmets also had red horsehair on top, but instead of side to side, these guys wore theirs front to back. Overall, Naruto silently admitted to himself that these guys looked cooler than the other soldiers. And then Naruto found himself drawn to a soldier who was riding just steps ahead of the other officers in front. Naruto wasn't sure why, but after his eyes had been drawn to this particular soldier, he couldn't look away. The man seemed to exude confidence, if his straight back and almost swaggering riding pace were any indication. His eyes were trained on the approaching gate, a wolfish smirk sat across his face. This man, Naruto guessed, was the general of the entire force. Then Naruto noticed something. The man had blue eyes. Eyes that seemed very familiar to him. Then, as if sensing someone's eyes upon him, the general looked up and met eye to eye with Naruto. End dream. Naruto bolted up from bed and quickly placed his hand over his racing heart, as if to try and soothe the thumping organ. The young blonde wasn't sure what had just happened. One minute he was staring at that general, the next, their eyes meet and he's thrust from his own dream as if he were an unwelcome quest. However, before awakening, Naruto remembered a feeling, when he looked into that guy's eyes. Not only had he felt the power of the man, the absolute dominating presence he seemed to give off in waves, but he also felt a sense of familiarity. As if he'd seen that man somewhere before. So engrossed was he in his thoughts, Naruto never noticed the bedroom door cracked open, nor the pale lavender eye that watched him so intensely. While Hinata could have used her Byakugan to watch her love sleep in that morning, it wasn't the same as seeing him in the flesh, instead of just a ghostly outline of him and his chakra pathways. Yes, she could have concentrated and gotten a better image, but again, she reasoned with herself, it just isn't the same. When she saw the wide-eyed look on his face upon his awakening, Hinata summarized he'd had either an exciting dream, or a terrible nightmare. While at first she'd hoped for the former, maybe it was about me, her mind swiftly turned against her and decided if it had been an exciting dream, it would have been about Sakura. And this made the Hyuga princess both sad, and very angry. Sad because she wanted her Naruto-kun to notice her as the one who should stand beside him as he rose to glory, but angry because his attention was given to someone so unworthy of it. Here was Sakura, being given the only thing Hinata's ever wanted, and she just throws it away like garbage. The thought just infuriated the young girl. She would do anything to have her Naruto-kun look at her the way he'd looked at Sakura, anything to gain favor with her most precious person. Anything. Breakfast was another mostly quiet affair, with the only real talking being Tsunami asking everyone how they'd slept and conversing with them about the dreams they'd had, if any. Naruto once again listened to his inner voice and told the other members of the breakfast table a more appropriate response. He told them he'd dreamed of a world where everywhere he went he was allowed free ramen. Hinata, knowing this to be a lie, but not wanting to risk displeasing Naruto by being nosy, and because I don't know how I'd explain knowing he was lying, kept quiet. And so breakfast continued on as it was. After breakfast was finished, and while Tsunami did the dishes with Hinata's offered help, Naruto and Tazuna retreated back into the study so Naruto could receive his map. And while Tazuna may not have noticed the pair of red eyes that would glance in their direction, Naruto did, and made a mental note to keep the map out of her sight so as not to arouse any more suspicion. Single quote, "I don't need her nosing around trying to figure out what I'm doing. I don't get why she won't just leave me alone." While Naruto and Tazuna entered the study, Kurenai and Ino made their way to the living room. It was a modest room, comprised of relatively nice furniture. A nice blue couch with stained wooden trim, a deep blue chaise lounge chair, and a nice little wooden coffee table in the center of the room. On the floor were various rugs of relatively good quality atop stained wooden floors. Kurenai took to sitting on the couch while asking Ino to take the lounge chair so that they could talk. Ino, confused about what the older Kunoichi wished to discuss, took her seat and waited patiently for Kurenai-sensei to address the topic of discussion. "Ino, have you noticed anything off during our time here? While I understand we've only been here for about a day, I personally felt as if something strange was going on. I was hoping to see if anyone else noticed it too." She didn't specify that it was Naruto that she felt off about because she wasn't sure how close the two blondes were to each other, and didn't want to risk being confronted for her curiosity. Luckily, she quickly learned there was no need for concealment. "I'm glad it's not just me, sensei, because yes, I've noticed Naruto has been acting strangely since even before we got here. Then, after we met up with Tazuna-san, he got even weirder. I tried to get a read off him last night after dinner when he got up to go to bed, but I dunno, I couldn't figure him out." Kurenai was relieved to learn that she wasn't the only one to notice the blonde boy's strange behavior. "I'm glad to know that I'm not the only one who's noticed. Normally I know Hinata would notice this kind of stuff, but, considering the subject, she probably doesn't think there's anything wrong with him." Ino snorted before replying, "Yeah, and I wasn't kidding last night when I said she was dead set on making sure that Stu was perfect. I mean, I get it if she's trying to score points with Naruto because I do something similar for Sasuke-kun, but she had this look in her eye when I would tell her something I thought needed fixing. Like she'd just committed a crime by not having the meal be perfect." This bit of news was like an ice block dropping in the Genjutsu mistress's stomach. She knew her student had feelings for the blonde Jinchuriki, but what Ino just described went far beyond any schoolgirl crush, and bordered on complete devotion to a single person. She desperately hoped her fears were unfounded. Unfortunately, the ice block in her stomach refused to melt away. Pushing her fears for her student to the back of her mind for the moment, Kurenai re-engaged Ino in conversation about the lone male on their squad and what they thought was causing his strange behavior. Naruto and Tazuna exited the study about an hour after they'd gone in, the map tucked away in one of the pockets Naruto's jumpsuit had on the inside, keeping it out of sight of prying, red eyes. Informing the rest of his team that he was going to visit Zabuza and Haku's graves for a while, Naruto had reached the front door when he heard a soft voice ask, "And Naruto-kun, do you think, maybe I could go with you?" Naruto felt a little bad at having to turn Hinata down, but he knew this was a trip meant solely for him to take right now. Maybe later, when he could speak with her alone, he'd let Hinata in on what he'd learned as well as what he was going to learn later today. Unfortunately, for now, he felt she was too close to her sensei and may speak to her about what she would learn. So for now he decided secrecy was his best option. Sorry Hinata, not today. Maybe some other time, okay? This is something I just want to do alone right now. It hurt him a little to see the disheartened look on her face, but he pushed that aside and was about to make his way out the door when the young girl asked. Naruto-kun? If it had been Sakura-san to ask, would you have allowed her to go with you? The blonde didn't even have to think about it before answering, no, and continuing out the door so as to avoid any more questions. If he had looked again he would have seen the light begin to return to Hinata's eyes at hearing that Sakura wouldn't have been preferred company over her. As Naruto walked through the village of Wave Country he noticed that many of the old, beaten down, wooden establishments and homes had become stone buildings with sturdy roofs and lines of customers. He also took notice that the people were happier, and their clothes had changed from patchy rags to tunics and strapped sandals. Some people also wore variants of what he'd seen Tazuna in. Some wore red, some blue, and even the occasional yellow robes. These particular people also held a certain air about them, almost like he'd seen Sasuke walk with, but less stuffy. No, that feeling belonged to the few men he'd seen in white tunics with a red pallium draped across it. But even those men gave Naruto sincere smiles in thanks for his returning the village to its former glory. After what felt like hours, Naruto arrived at the ruins of Wave Country. He'd known he was close when he began to see pieces of columns and triumphal arches. Things he'd learned from Tazuna as he was drawing the map. The young blonde was amazed by the craftsmanship exhibited through these pieces of history, even if they were eroded by time. He knew he'd officially arrived when he saw that there were actual whole buildings still standing. He walked through what seemed to be a neighborhood judging from the types of building he saw. They look like apartments. Wait, Tazuna said there was a name for those. Insuli, I think it was. He quietly made his way down the worn-down, stone-paved path. He noticed the, for its day, ingenuitive design of the drainage ditches and how the road was cambered which allowed it to be drained. Naruto walked down this road, and many others, admiring and inspecting the forgotten world around him, until he finally happened upon the building Tazuna told him specifically to seek. The temple was, like most of the other buildings, wash white due to age. It sat atop a raised platform and had steps that lead you to the small stretch of platform that lead to the entryway. There were 6 columns that held up the front of the roof, a roof that looked like a flat, but three-dimensional, triangle. There were columns along both sides as well to assist in holding up this roof before they morphed into walls of a building. Look up Maison Carré for an idea of what it looks like. The temple was huge. It was longer and taller than any other temple he'd seen by far. And according to Tazuna, it was dedicated entirely to Caesar. The temple, also according to the bridge builder, was said to have housed Caesar's own written works. His campaign journals. It's also said that his family records had been included in his temple, and that every generation up until about 50 years ago, had inscribed their name into the line. When Naruto asked why Caesar's temple was built in Wave Country rather than Rome itself, Tazuna replied. A temple was built in Rome, but they moved his works and the family records to Wave because of Caesar's enemies. If they'd found his journals then they'd be able to implement his brilliant military strategies in a way no Romans felt was proper. The people felt that for a non-relative of Caesar to even look in the book was an offense to the man's memory. And if his enemies had known the location of his family record at any time? Then his bloodline would have ceased to exist centuries ago out of their fear of another Caesar being born. Naruto slowly began his ascent of the temple steps and then, as he reached the platform, he noticed some Latin words inscribed above the entrance that read, "Vivat Caesar, long live Caesar." After reading the inscription on the wall, Naruto once again began his entrance into the temple. As he began to move forward the blonde could feel the knot in his stomach returning, and the anxiousness in his heart began to cause the organ to beat rapidly. He remembered the last time he'd felt this way was rewarded with knowledge of this once great empire and a famous general. So, with thoughts of what the reward would be for this time, Naruto strode in with a more confident step. He was completely unprepared for what he saw upon entering the temple. There, in the very center of the temple, stood a statue. This statue was so tall, it missed touching the ceiling by perhaps 5 to 10 feet. While Naruto was sure it had at one time been colored, it now stood white like everything else in the ruins. However, unlike everything else, the color loss was the only indication that this statue had been affected by time. There were no cracks, no chips, and no erosion. The statue had remained in perfect condition. The statue depicted Caesar in the same outfit as Naruto had seen the general in his dream wear, except he'd taken off his helmet and held it tucked underneath his arm while his right arm sat holding the hilt of his gladius, showing him to be left-handed. However, as magnificent as the statue was, the thing that truly caught Naruto's attention was the mont's face. With his helmet off, Naruto could see very clearly the face of the great dictator. It also explained why Naruto had felt such a familiarity with the blue-eyed general in his dream. What he saw brought tears to his eyes. Because what Naruto saw was an adult version of himself. Naruto couldn't believe his eyes. There, standing right in front of him, was essentially a giant statue of himself. It was seeing this that made Naruto realize why Tazuna had been so insistent about speaking with him, why he'd told Naruto about Rome and the ruins of Wave Country. Naruto was a descendant of Caesar, the greatest man in an empire's entire history. It almost seemed too good to be true. But then, years of hurtful words and scorn from an entire population began to rear its ugly head, and Naruto found himself feeling a bit of doubt. How can I be related to someone so important? This guy was loved by, basically, his entire empire, while I'm looked at like a disease on human society. It just doesn't seem possible. Despite Naruto's recent enlightenment to his own advanced mind, he still found it hard to believe that he could be related to the powerful figure that stood before him. No matter how much his own mind screamed it was true. But then Naruto remembered the family records that had been placed at the very back room of the temple. The records that had been continuously written in up until 50 years ago, and was bound to be able to tell the blonde if any Uzumakis had written in it. With this hope in mind, Naruto began a mad dash for the rear of the temple. Passing by several rooms which Naruto had learned were used by the shrine maidens of old, the blonde found himself at the entryway to the last room. Stopping just outside the doorway, all Naruto could see from his position was the blank wall in front of him. He tried to take a step forward, so as to get a look at what was inside, but his legs wouldn't move. He was afraid. Naruto feared that this was all a joke or a dream. He feared that he would look through the logbook and find that he was not related to the great man whose statue he'd just left. He expected, and slightly hoped, that this was all just a dream and that he would wake up as soon as he entered this room. He hoped for the dream scenario because it wasn't the first time he'd had a dream like this. Only in those others he was related to the fourth Hokage, not a ruler of an entire empire. As Naruto stood there, debating what to do, he felt the knot reappear in his stomach. Something that was happening a lot lately. Then he remembered that it was this same knot that he'd felt just moments ago as he was debating whether to enter the temple or not. And when he went along with the feeling, he found the statue, something that wouldn't have come to pass had he played it safe and turned around. So, armed with renewed faith, the young Uzumaki stepped through the doorway and into the final room of the temple. What he saw wasn't what he'd been expecting. Whereas Naruto had expected the final room to be immaculately furnished, the room he walked into was sparse and nearly empty. The room was about the size of Naruto's apartment and consisted of a plain table and chair, with a black leather-bound book sitting in the middle of the desk, as well as a small shelf on the wall, both just out of sight of someone standing outside the door. The shelf contained 2 rows of books, all brown, leather-bound and 4 fingers thick. Naruto guessed those were Caesar's campaign journals, which made the black book on the table the family records. With a lump in his throat, Naruto slowly walked over to the chair, pulled it out, and sat down. After scooting in, the young blonde let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, causing the dust on the tabletop to kick up and swirl around in the air. A testament to just how much time had passed since anyone had been in this room. He lifted his shaking hand and reached out towards the book. Almost immediately after Naruto had left the house, Tsunami asked Hinata if she'd go out and get ingredients for dinner that night. Hinata, always the polite one, accepted the task with a smile. And so, Hinata now found herself walking through the village with grocery bags in hand. She was happy to do a favor for someone who saw her Naruto-kun as the great person he was, a person who deserved nothing but the utmost respect and unwavering loyalty. Her mind spoke up. Hinata found nothing wrong with her devotion to the blue-eyed, blonde-haired genin. She'd seen how other girls acted around Sasuke when she'd gone to the academy, and felt she was different because her feelings were feelings of love, not just some schoolgirl crush. She didn't find it odd that she was so inclined to gain favor from her Naruto-kun, nor did the young Hyuga find it strange that she didn't share the depths of her feelings with her surrogate older sister Kurenai. She wouldn't understand anyway, she'd probably just think I was acting like those girls at the academy. Well, she, and everyone else for that matter, won't have anything to say when my Naruto-kun is standing atop the Hokage building giving his inauguration speech. And I'll be right there by his side. He'll have finally realized that I've always been there for him and will reward me for my devotion. With that ending thought, Hinata entered into a state of bliss as her mind began to play out the different ways her Naruto-kun would reward her for being so devoted to him. This led the Hyuga princess to needing to find a secluded area where she could feel the full effects of her imagination. I don't think Tsunami-san will mind if I take a little detour getting home. It is rather warm out today after all. And with that, the young Kunoichi veered off towards the forest to help relieve herself of the heat. Tazuna sat in his study staring at the map he'd shown Naruto yesterday, his eyes trained on one spot in particular. He was staring at Rome. He still couldn't fully grasp what he'd learned about Naruto and his connection to Caesar. He'd made the discovery a few short weeks after Naruto and his team left from Wave. Flashback. Tazuna was stumbling about, just coming out of another drunken stupor. When he fully came to his senses, he noticed that he had entered into some of the woods that encircled Wave. Although he didn't recognize any of his surroundings, he looked around and noticed a stone road that seemed to go on for miles. Deciding that following the road was his best bet, Tazuna began to walk. He walked for what he guessed was an hour and a half before he noticed broken columns and triumphal arches? But columns haven't been used in ages. Not since Roman times. Tazuna's mind began to click everything into place. The stone roads, the columns, the arches, it could only mean one thing. He'd found Roman ruins. Tazuna could feel the smile that stretched from ear to ear across his face and the swelling of his heart upon realizing just what he'd found. He'd grown up on tales of the ancient empire, hearing tales of Marius, Hadrian, and of course, he was told stories of Caesar. He'd been raised with a high sense of patriotism, which was why he'd fought so hard to free his country from Gato, because he refused to see a piece of the once great Roman Empire put under the thumb of some low-level thug. And so, Tazuna continued his trek through the ruins, taking in the craftsmanship of the columns and arches, true works of art. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Tazuna happened upon the entrance of a town, a real, still standing, town. His excitement mounting to new levels, Tazuna's pace quickened, wanting to begin exploring the ancient treasure he'd stumbled upon. He knew he was in for a long night. Hours had passed since Tazuna had discovered the desolate but beautiful town. He'd explored the forum and all its shops, finding blacksmith equipment in some buildings. He'd scoured through homes, finding what appeared to be old-world clay ovens in the homes of upper-class citizens and then finding braziers, stoves for the poor, in the insulae of the lower-class citizens. He journeyed then to the temples and government buildings. What he would find there would forever change the course of history. Having just exited a temple of Jupiter, the old bridge builder was greeted with light as the sun began to rise seemingly out of the trees. This brought the novice explorer to a standstill as he realized, I've been out all night, Tsunami's probably worried sick, not to mention how Inari probably feels. I should go home for now. I can always come back later, and next time I can bring others. So, with his mind made up, Tazuna turned and started walking away. The man had made it to the entrance to the town when he heard it. A bird call. Normally Tazuna would just ignore it and continue with his business, but he'd never heard this type of bird call before. That, accompanied by the tightening knot in his stomach, enticed the older man to turn around and find the bird. What he saw astonished him greatly. There, perched atop the roof of one of the shops, sat an eagle. This shocked the man because eagles were not native to Wave Country, and were never seen flying in its airways. So then what was one doing here now? Then Tazuna noticed something strange. The bird seemed to be looking right at him. As Tazuna began to back away, the bird let out another cry, and continued to do so with each step back the bridge builder took. It's as if the bird's telling me to wait, he mumbled quietly. So he took a few steps forward, and was rewarded with a shrill chirping that sounded almost like, yes. Tazuna, still unsure of what was going on, remembered that the eagle was not only the symbol of Rome, but also Jupiter's favorite form to take when dealing with mortals. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Before he could ponder it any further, the bird hopped from its perch and floated in the air, its wings gently flapping to keep it afloat, and then turned around and began to fly back into the city. While still unsure what to make of what he was seeing, Tazuna decided that there was really no harm in following the bird. After all, he was already late getting home. What difference would it make? So he began to run, chasing down the eagle that had stopped again to wait for him. He ran for what felt like forever, passing by familiar buildings he remembered exploring the night before, and then catching glances at the buildings he had yet to explore as the bird carried him deeper into the ancient city. Finally, the majestic bird settled on the rooftop of a building. And what a building it was! Tazuna now stood in front of the largest building he'd seen in among the ruins. Ruins, this temple looks like it hasn't aged a day. But he didn't have long to marvel as the bird began to call to him again. Looking up, Tazuna noticed, once again, that the eagle was looking right at him. It would look at him and then turn its head down, before lifting it again and letting out a cry that echoed across the city. Following the knot in his stomach, Tazuna began to walk forward until he reached the bottom step that led to the temple. He could feel his heart race as he looked to the step, and then to the bird perched above him. Only to see that the bird was gone. The man rushed back a few feet to be able to see beyond the temple as he searched the skies, but there was no bird in sight, not even a speck in the cloudless sky to show that it had flown away. This only made the bridge builder's heart race faster. He'd heard many legends and tales of how the eagle of Jupiter guided men and women to a path that would later lead to greatness, or appear and fly away from a place to hint at danger if Jupiter felt your life was worth sparing. Taking note that the bird had appeared and flown to the temple, Tazuna took heart in the knowledge that it was the former. With a renewed sense of purpose, Tazuna walked back to the steps, and began his ascent towards the temple door. What he saw once he'd reached the platform nearly knocked the man off his feet. There, above the entryway, was the Latin words for, "Long live Caesar." This was unbelievable. Tazuna was floored. His legs felt weak, they shook, before he sank to his knees. Feeling wetness on his face, he reached up. When he pulled his hand away, he found he was crying. Tears of joy continued to stream down his face as he began to laugh. He'd actually found it. One of the stories he'd been told as a boy was that one of Caesar's temples had been built somewhere in Wave Country, long before it was ever known as such, and was the home of not only the Mont's military journals, but his family record as well. And now, thanks to the eagle, he'd found it. While still on his knees, the Tazuna did a quick prayer, and sent thanks to the gods, before standing on shaking legs and slowly making his way inside. Once he'd reached the entryway, he noticed a large set of legs standing atop a platform, a statue of Caesar no doubt, and what he saw once he was finally inside astounded him. The statue was a masterpiece. Every detail looked to have been sculpted with the utmost care, creating the most lifelike image out of stone that Tazuna had ever seen. It looked as if the statue would step right off the platform and head right into battle. Tazuna spent long minutes inspecting the statue from his place on the ground, continuously finding something new to marvel at. The way the cape seemed as if it would begin to rustle in the unseen wind. The way the muscles in the arms expressed readiness in how they were positioned, and then there was the face. When the older man's sight reached the face of the great general, his eyes nearly rolled right out of his head. He was staring Naruto. End flashback. Tazuna recalled, after coming out of his shock, searching the temple and found the family records. What he found made the man do something he'd never imagined himself doing. He fainted. After awakening from his impromptu slumber, the bridge builder placed the book back on the table and rushed home as quickly as possible. He had to let everyone know what he'd found. First, of course, he returned home where he was engulfed in a teary hug from his daughter, who thought him dead in some hole or mauled by the wildlife of the forest. Tazuna quickly put his daughter's mind at rest and told her of his discovery. Flashback. Tsunami, I'm sorry I worried you so much. I was out drinking last night. At this his daughter let out a huff of disappointment. Sigh. Yes, I know, but I was out drinking last and wound up wandering into the woods. When I finally came back to my senses, I wasn't really sure where I was, and then I noticed a stone path. I followed the path and, tsunami, you'll never believe what I found. He went on to tell her of everything he'd experienced while he was out, and by the end of his tale, Tsunami was just as excited as he was. She, like Tazuna, was raised on stories of the Roman Empire. And now to hear that it had a chance to resurface? It was almost too good to be true. So the two of them gathered up the people of Wave Country and Tazuna lead them to the ruins. The town seemed to just come alive again, with all the people walking around, oohing, and awing, at the ancient world around them. This went on for several hours, everyone wanting to see and experience everything the old world treasure had to offer. Finally, after everyone began to settle in at the forum, Tazuna spoke out. People of Wave, hear me. I know that this has been an exciting day for all of you, but there is still more to see. At hearing this, murmurs broke out. More? What more could we want to see? I don't know, but it's got Tazuna excited, so I want to find out. These, and more of the same, were what greeted Tazuna's declaration. He responded incline. Now, I know it may seem hard to believe, but what I have next to show you will surely be worth it. If you would all follow me, I will show you the real reason I was so excited. When most of the village looked on in skepticism, Tsunami came forward in her father's defense. People, please, trust that what my father says is the truth. You trusted him to save us from Gato and he did. You trusted him today, when you know in your heats how unlikely his tale seemed. All he's asking is that you put your trust in him one more time, and let him bring you the same joy he feels now. What's so wrong with that? That did it. Every member of the village broke out into a smile, and a look of belief shined in their eyes as they stood straighter, bodies filled with a new sense of anticipation. They were ready to be shown this new great wonder. Tazuna sent a grateful smile to his daughter before turning and walking off towards Caesar's temple. Upon arrival at the temple, the villagers' mouths dropped to the ground in awe of its greatness. Never before had they laid eyes upon something so immaculate. It was after hearing Tazuna's next words that sent the mass of people into a frenzy. My fellow villagers, each of us were raised by our parents on the stories and customs of the once great empire of Rome. Stories and customs we have passed down to our own children, who will no doubt pass it on to their own children. I bring you here today to inform you. The days of the Roman Empire will soon rise again. Many of the villagers were weary of the bridge builder's words. This wasn't to say they didn't wish for the return of those ancient days, but it just didn't seem possible. Tazuna, sensing their hesitation, quickly spoke up again. Wait, stay and listen. Inside this temple lies the tools to the Empire's glorious return, I promise you. For this is no ordinary temple. This is the temple of Gaius Julius Caesar. He finished his exclamation with the throwing out of his arms in excitement. Tazuna's words struck a chord in every individual standing outside the temple. While it's true that they'd all grown up hearing different tales of famous Romans, everyone's favorite stories were always the ones that involved the great dictator. His very name caused a tingle to shoot up their spines. The children's eyes all widened in glee at hearing his name, as they had all gone to bed with stories of the Mont's bravery and heroic deeds. Seeing that everyone was ready, Tazuna began funneling them into the temple. End flashback. Tazuna let out a laugh at remembering the people's faces when they learned that their savior, Naruto Uzumaki, was also the descendant of their great Caesar. Suddenly Tazuna's belief in the resurrection of Rome didn't seem so far-fetched. He'd sent the mission request to the Leaf as an excuse to get Naruto here, so Tazuna could show and teach Naruto about Rome. Then, with the boy's curiosity stoked, he'd tell the blonde about the ruins. He wasn't at all surprised at the boy's ability to ward off that Junin. He knew the kid was more clever than others gave him credit for. And now, with the knowledge that Caesar was his ancestor, he knew that the boy's cleverness would only become more dangerous to his enemies. Now, all that was left to do was wait, and be ready for the rebirth of the eagle. Naruto sat there, his hand hanging in the air above the black book on the table in front of him. He wasn't really sure how long he'd sat there, it felt like days. But what he did know was that he wouldn't ever find out the truth if he didn't open the book and take a look inside. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Naruto pulled the cover over and revealed what appeared to be an author's note on the front cover. Caesarem quasi hydre amputavit caput, et multo plures tantum locum dedit. Unfortunately, Naruto had not learned enough Latin from Tazuna that day to be able to read the whole thing. The only word he'd really been able to decipher was Caesar. After adding learning Latin to his list of things to do when he left, Naruto began to once again flip through the book, scouring through the names in hopes of finding his own. While Naruto searched for a link to his past, Kurenai stood atop the balcony of Tazuna's home deep in thought. I just can't seem to figure it out. What could those two have been in such deep discussion about? And then there was this morning. They go into the study again, and then Naruto comes out and just decides he's going to check on some grave. I highly doubt it. In fact, the ruby-eyed Junin doubted it so much that she'd sent a clone out to the graves soon after he left, and she got the location from Tsunami. She learned, after it dispelled itself, that the blonde genin never actually visited the graves. He'd lied, which could really only mean one thing. He knew she was watching him. That kid's a hell of a lot smarter than Kakashi-san gave him credit for. I wonder how he'll react when I inform him of just how clever his student really is. Speaking of informing others, she knew she'd have to report her charge's strange behavior to not only the Hokage, but Master Jiraiya as well. Perhaps they could shed a little light on just what Naruto's strange behavior could mean. Until then, all she could really do now was wait. Ino was bored. Ino Yamanaka hated being bored. But then there wasn't much else she could do right now anyway. For the first time, she didn't feel like going out and browsing the shops of another village. She just wanted to go home. She didn't even understand why she'd been given the mission in the first place. I mean, yeah, I'm a future clan head, but that doesn't mean I really need to go on these kinds of missions, does it? And I don't even have anyone to interact with on this team. Hinata's no fun to talk to, and the only thing she probably even wants to talk about is Naruto, which is a subject I am not interested. The female blonde let her thoughts stop for a moment as she thought about the other blonde on the team. The one who'd been acting strangely. She'd never really been close to Naruto, but she didn't necessarily dislike him as Sakura seemed to. She just never found any merit in being his friend. In the academy he was so loud and annoying, his stupid pranks and his awful jokes. Ino wasn't sure what Hinata saw in him. But now, the Naruto that was on this mission with her seemed like the complete opposite of what she's used to. The Naruto she'd gone on this mission with was quiet, calculative, and dare she say it, cool. Peeved. Naruto and cool, two words I never expected to have in the same sentence unless there was a not in between them. But something's been up with him since he learned about our mission from Wave. Almost as if he was expecting something to happen after we got here, which something did happen. He met that guy, Tazuna, and ever since their little conversation in the street, the two of them have been acting weird. Ino wasn't sure what was going on, but when she thought about Naruto and his strange behavior, she could feel the beginnings of a knot start to form in her stomach. What that meant, she dreaded to guess. Her thoughts were broken by Hinata's return with the groceries for dinner that night. I'm gonna have to talk to Shikamaru about this when we get back. Hinata wiped her face on her sleeve. After relieving herself from the heat she'd been feeling, the young girl went in search of a body of water to help her cool off from her activities. Luckily she was in a country that was surrounded by water. She couldn't believe she'd really just pleasured herself out in the middle of the woods. What'd her Naruto-kun think of her if he'd learned of such a thing? He might never accept me if he knew what I just did. I have to make sure he doesn't find out. While normal girls wouldn't have thought this way, Hinata Hyuga was no normal girl. Her devotion to the blonde Jinchuriki was absolute. An order from him superseded even that of the Hokage or her own father. After years of neglect at the hands of her claw, Hinata became dependent on the sense of confidence and self-worth she got from watching Naruto. He'd become her entire world, and he hadn't even known it. But that will all change. Soon, I'll be strong enough to not only tell him how I feel, but also show him as well. Then, when he sees what I've done for him, he'll allow me the privilege of serving him. With those reassuring words, the fiercely loyal Hyuga princess began her return to Tazuna's house, where she would wait patiently for her Naruto-kun. Naruto sat there, his eyes glued to the page in front of him. It read, Kagato Uzumaki. There it was, near the very end of the book. Naruto didn't know who this Kagato was, but he held the name Uzumaki, so that counted for something, right? Don't start panicking, Tazuna said. It's been 50 years since anyone's written in this book. For all I know, this guy could be my grandfather or something. I'll just have to. Before the young Uzumaki could finish his thought, he noticed something near the bottom of the page. It was faded, but it looked like letters. Knowing he would need better light to see, Naruto decided to head outside the temple. Once outside, Naruto carefully opened the book back to the last page, and held it so that the sunlight would cause the paper to become see-through. When he looked at the bottom of the page again, there, in childish scrawl, was another name. Kushina Uzumaki. Although Naruto still didn't know who this person was, a girl from the sound of it, he was even more certain now that he was related to the man whose statue resembled him. He just had to figure out who was Kushina Uzumaki. For the moment though, he'd go back inside and take a look at all the things he'd passed over in his rush to find the truth. So, turning around, Naruto walked back up the steps and into the temple. After returning inside, Naruto put the book inside one of the pockets of his jumpsuit, so as not to run the risk of laying it down somewhere and forgetting it. He searched through each room he came across, though most of them were boring bedrooms. Then, as he reached farther back in the temple, he came across something interesting. He found a mannequin wearing the same suit of armor as the statue. He noticed that, while not in the worst condition, the armor was still unreliable in battle due to its age and lack of use. And yet, despite its aged appearance, the armor still held its dignified look. Deciding he liked the look of the armor and the sense of power he felt coming from it, Naruto came up with an idea. Why not have my own set of armor made? So, after going back to where he found the records, the blonde genin found an inkwell and a quill, sitting on one of the shelves of the bookcase, that he took back to the room with the mannequin. When he returned with his utensils, Naruto sat in front of the suit and began to sketch it on one of the blank pages at the back of the log. He followed this up by drawing it from both sides, as well as the back, until he had a perfect set of blueprints for the entire suit of armor, from the helmet to the metal guards on the shin. Naruto also made sure to gently move back the folds of the red cloak, so as to get a better look at the whole cuirass. In doing so, the blonde revealed a set of leather shoulder pads that sat over the armholes of the armor. Another thing Naruto discovered, as he made a full trip around the armor, was that the leather shoes were actually more like boots. They went as high as the middle of the calf. Figuring he'd spent enough time in the ruins, Naruto decided he'd call it a day. After grabbing a rucksack from one of the bedrooms and placing the records and his map back in his jacket pocket, Naruto exited the temple and began his walk back to town. Just have to make one stop before going back to the house. Hello, and welcome to Shuichi Nagita froze, his greeting left unfinished as he stared at who had just entered his store. Tazuna was right, he looks just like him. Standing at the doorway to Shuichi's shop was Naruto Uzumaki. Hello sir, I saw your sign outside and was hoping you could help me with something. You are the master blacksmith, right? When Naruto first saw the sign that read, Shuichi's Swords and Armors, he had been expecting to see a large, burly man standing in front of a forge with a leather apron and a smithing hammer in it. What he got was something totally opposite. The man in front of him wasn't thin or out of shape, he just had a more athletic build than one would expect from a master blacksmith. Although, he at least looked old enough to be a master blacksmith, at least he's got a beard. The man was dressed in a sturdy tunic and probably strapped sandals, had shoulder-length black hair that was tied back in a ponytail, wore a full beard on his face, and was covered in black soot. His muscled arms were crossed in front of his chest and were resting on the counter he stood behind. When Naruto asked his question, the man blinked his charcoal eyes and refocused his attention on the blonde in front of him. Ahem, I can assure you, young man, I am the blacksmith you seek. Shuichi by this point had walked from around the counter and had extended his hand. My name is Shuichi Nagita, welcome to my store. Naruto extended his own hand and gripped the older man's in a firm grip. My name's Naruto Uzumaki, and I was hoping you could handle a request I'd like done? I have the designs here. Naruto pulled out the black book and opened it to the proper page, but I have no skill in forging and require a skilled hand, preferably the best in the village, to bring it to life. Are you able to help me? Naruto cocked his eyebrow in curiosity as he waited for the man to speak. Shuichi had taken the book from the young Uzumaki and looked at the page he'd turned to. Upon seeing the designs he was taking about, Shuichi's heart nearly stopped. These designs, where did you come up with such an idea? If I may be so bold to ask? The blonde merely smirked, giving him a wolfish expression. I think you and I both know where these designs came from, Mr. Nagita. I came to this shop because I felt a pull when I walked by. Now, make no mistake, this wasn't the first shop I passed. No, there were a handful of others, and I recall feeling a pull towards a few of them, but the feeling I got as I walked by your shop was so strong it nearly caused me to topple over. I knew then that this was the place that would help me begin my ascent to greatness. Or was I mistaken? Naruto ended his response with a slight turning down of his head, his brow furrowed as if in thought, and his eyes taking on a questioning gleam as if he were truly thinking about his decision. Shuichi, after hearing Naruto's tale, and knowing how good this opportunity was for him, quickly ate up the bait the blonde had thrown out. No, no sir, you were not mistaken. I would be more than happy to take on this request for you. It should be ready within the week. That wasn't good enough for the Uzumaki. I want it in 2 days. 2 days. Yes sir, you must understand, quality work takes time. Especially if you're hoping to wear this into combat. Funny, I seem to recall seeing a sign somewhere saying they offered the fastest delivery in town. Maybe I should go there. I'm sure they could have it done in 2 days. Heck, they might try to show off and have to me by tomorrow. What do you think? Shuichi understood now. He understood the importance of the items he was being asked to create. These weren't just tools to be used in battle, no, these were a symbol. A symbol that the eagle had risen like a phoenix from the ashes and was ready to take the world under its wing again. With this in mind, Shuichi knew only one response was appropriate. He placed his fist over his heart and spoke. I fall to command, Imperator. Naruto and his squad stood at the entrance of Wave, all packed and ready for their return to Konoha. We thank you again for your hospitality, Tazuna-san. You made our stay here most enjoyable. Kurenai said with sincerity. The quartet had stayed with Tazuna and his family for a week after arriving, but they each knew that after so long away, it was time to return home. Think nothing of it, we were more than happy to welcome our hero back. Tazuna's response was cut off by shouts of, Naruto-sama. Looking to the crowd behind them, the huddle of 5 could see a man pushing his way through the mob of villagers. Naruto noticed that it was Shuichi. Naruto-sama, I have the last part of your request. At this, the blacksmith removed a cloth bundle from around his chest and presented it to the blonde that stood before him. Please, I humbly ask that you accept my apology for being so late with the completion of your order. I have no excuse. Naruto looked down at the man who bowed before him before taking a quick glance at the crowd. Knowing that his reaction would set the pace for his plans for Wave, Naruto decided on how to handle this. Whether or not your lateness will be forgiven depends on the quality of what you've brought me. Unfortunately for you, my inspection of your work will be done back in my home. But rest assured, you will be hearing from me soon. With that said, Naruto wrapped the cloth bundle around his chest, tying it in the front and turning away from the man to face Tazuna. Where do we stand in regards to what we spoke of the other night? Naruto questioned softly, so as to avoid letting nosy Junin overhear. It's been started, Naruto. When the first section is complete, I will have a messenger bird send word of its completion. Nodding his approval, Naruto gave one last look at the crowd of people that looked upon him with loyalty and respect. And so it begins. The journey back from Wave was significantly faster than the arrival. This was due to the fact that, instead of walking, the squad of ninja were tree-hopping. Upon orders of its Junin commander, Kurenai wanted to return to Konoha as soon as possible. After a week of strange behavior including disappearances, secret talks, a complete 180 of attitude, and other strange things, Kurenai had gotten extremely weary of her male charge. Even stranger were the items he now carried with him. When we get there he's got nothing, but when we leave he's got a rucksack and a bundle of cloth. Both holding something suspicious, no doubt. The problem was, Kurenai couldn't just order Naruto to show her what he'd picked up. She had to have probable cause before commanding another ninja, no matter the rank, to reveal their personal effects on a mission. Which she unfortunately did not have. She glanced behind her and took stock of the blonde male currently under her care. Naruto's eyes held a different, sharper light than they had before the trip to Wave. Where there was once warm, sky blue gems now said 2 calculating, cobalt stones. Where there was once always a ghost of a smile, now sat. Not a scowl, but more of an ever-concentrating look. As if its wearer were in constant thought or observing the world around him. This Naruto Uzumaki Kurenai was bringing back to Konoha was most definitely not the Naruto she'd been joined by in the Hokage's office when they'd been assigned their mission. Naruto, who had been in deep thought over his final talks with Tazuna, sensed someone watching him and brought his mind back to the present. Without letting her know, Naruto did his own analysis of her. She'd been weary of him since the first night they'd spent at Tazuna's home. He noticed it during dinner when she'd tried to subtly interrogate Tazuna, as well as himself. While Naruto wasn't sure why the female Junin was so interested in his affairs, he was sure about one thing: he didn't like it. I'll have to be careful for the time being. There's no telling what kind of trouble could be caused if I don't exercise a bit more caution with my plans. Although, Naruto wasn't the only blonde on the team in deep thought. Ino stared at the male who ran ahead of her, her thoughts on the subject a swirling mass of confusion. I just don't know what to make of all this. Naruto's acting way weird, Kurenai-sensei's acting weird about Naruto acting weird, and even Hinata's acting weirder than usual. Oh man, it's times like these I wish I had Shikamaru's brain. Resolving once again to seek out her slacker genius teammate upon returning to the village, Ino did her best to push the clusterfuck of confusing thoughts to the back of her mind and focus on the journey home. It was harder than she thought. When the quartet of ninja reached the front gate of their home, 3 of the 4 ninja had to rein in their anxiousness to enter the village and begin their personal missions. Hinata was not one of those 3. Hinata had dreaded coming home, because that meant going back to the Hyuga compound and dealing with the harsh, cold mannerisms of her family. Her depressed thoughts were broken by her sensei's words. "Alright team, I'll go and give the mission report to Lady Tsunade, the rest of you are free to go." Hinata, seeing no way out, drooped her head and began to walk in the direction of her home. However, her departure was halted when another voice, a male voice, called out to her. "Hey, Hinata, do you have some time to talk with me tomorrow? There are some things that I really want to talk to you about. Is that okay?" Hinata almost couldn't believe her ears. Her Naruto-kun wanted to talk with her. But this didn't sit well with Kurenai. The Genjutsu mistress didn't trust having this new Naruto around her student. Hinata's frightening level of feelings for the blonde, coupled with Naruto's new silver tongue, were a dangerous combination. "Hinata, don't forget we have team training tomorrow. Don't you think afterward you should relax, because it sounds like Naruto wants to have a pretty deep discussion and I'm not sure you'll have the energy for such a thing once we've finished." Kurenai hoped that her words would cause the girl to consider turning down the offer. Her hopes were dashed. "I don't see the problem, Kurenai-sensei. Are you saying Hinata doesn't have the fortitude to handle team training as well as a discussion with a friend?" Naruto ended his rebuttal by staring directly into the woman's ruby-red eyes with his own cool, cobalt pair. A staring contest ensued, but it wasn't just a game, it was a test. Whoever blinked first failed, and Kurenai could feel her eyes start to sting. She was saved though when Hinata had came to her decision. "Kurenai-sensei, I'll be fine. Naruto-kun wouldn't ask to speak with me if it wasn't important. And besides, I am not some feeble little girl. I can handle team training and then having a deep discussion." Hinata's response started off docile before sounding like someone who'd been offended. Kurenai picked up on her tone and winced. By trying to protect her student, she'd inadvertently hit upon her insecurities and made her feel that to turn Naruto down would make her seem weak. Something Kurenai knew Hinata never wanted to have happen. Damn it, I was so intent on blocking Naruto that I wasn't watching what I said to Hinata. I only hope this doesn't turn out as bad as I think it will. I'm sorry Hinata, I didn't mean to come out that way. I just want to make sure you're not overdoing it. With that, knowing there was nothing else she could say, Kurenai left in a swirl of leaves to report to Tsunade. Naruto bid Hinata goodbye, with a reassurance that they would talk the following day after her training. Hinata, with nothing left to distract her, finally began the journey home. None of them noticed that the 4th member of their squad had left immediately after reaching the gate. After being dismissed by Kurenai, Ino swiftly walked off in search of the rest of her assigned team. She first went to their homes, but when she found they weren't there she decided to check the only other spot she knew they frequented. Upon arrival at the grassy field, Ino spotted both of her male teammates laying in the shade of a big oak tree. Well, Shikamaru's laying, Choji's sitting up eating chips. Pushing that thought aside, the platinum blonde walked over and greeted her 2 longest friend. "Hey guys, I'm back from my mission. Did anything interesting happen while I was gone? Or did the 2 of you just lay around every day?" What started off as a polite greeting ended in a snarky accusation. Shikamaru never sat up. he simply glanced over at the lone female on his team and said, "Actually, Ino, something interesting did happen while you were away." The girl's eyes widened in anticipation. "It was so quiet in that me and Choji actually managed to relax while you were gone." The look of anticipation fell away and was replaced with annoyance at the shadow manipulator's jab. Ino was ready to explode on her teammates. W had begun to laugh at her, when she suddenly remembered what it was she really wanted to speak with Shikamaru about. "Hey, Shika, there's actually something I was hoping I could talk to you about. See, while I was on the mission, I started noticing something strange going with Naruto. I talked with Kurenai-sensei about it, since she noticed it too, but I didn't really get any answers from that conversation. And obviously I didn't talk to Hinata about him, she would have been even less help. I figured I would talk to you, and maybe you could help me figure it out." While Ino stood there waiting for him to reply, Shikamaru was already wondering what Naruto, of all people, could have done to make his female friend so intrigued. "Well, why don't you start by telling me just what it is that Naruto was doing that's got you coming and interrupting my cloud watching with your troublesome question?" Ignoring Shikamaru's trademark use of troublesome to describe her question, Ino began to tell her two male friends what she'd observed over the trip to Wave. The strange, secret conversations between Naruto and Tazuna. Even throwing in the weird talk they'd had in the middle of the street. The way Naruto spoke to Kurenai and how he'd managed to dodge her probing questions. Hinata's increasingly strange behavior, and finally the items Naruto had brought back from the trip. Throughout Ino's entire retelling of the mission, Shikamaru's mind had been spinning its wheels trying to come up with an idea of why the things she mentioned had happened. He had a hunch based off what Ino had told him of their first night in Wave, but he didn't want to jump to any conclusions, especially if his hunch proved correct. His thoughts were broken by Ino's shouting, "Shika, are you even listening to me anymore?" "Sigh, not really, Ino, I was too busy trying to figure out the answer to your troublesome question. So unless you don't really want my help, I'd appreciate you being quiet for a bit, okay?" Ino's mouth clicked shut and her cheeks gained a pink tint to them after hearing Shikamaru's tone. Shikamaru sat up and entered into his traditional thinking pose. While Ino was working on the Naruto mystery, from her own angle, Kurenai was currently standing in the Hokage's office speaking with her about it. "The diplomatic mission was a success, we arrived without issue and our time there went smoothly." Tsunade sat at her desk, fingers steepled in front of her face, an eyebrow raised as she listened to Kurenai report their mission. Tsunade was a woman who, while in her 50s, was considered one of the most beautiful women in the elemental nations. Her straight, blonde hair was tied in two loose ponytails, with bangs framing both sides of her face. She wore a green haori with the kanji for gamble on the back over top a gray, sleeveless, kimono-style blouse which she held closed with a dark blue obi. Instead of traditional ninja sandals, Tsunade wore open-toed, black high heels. On her forehead sat a violet rhombus mark. However, her most recognizable feature was her breasts. Tsunade was owner of one of the largest pair in the elemental nations. "You say everything went well, and yet I can sense the tension in your body. Heck, I can practically see it. What's got you so wound up?" Kurenai visibly flinched at being called out on her anxiousness. She thought she had done well at hiding it. While she had intended to speak with the Hokage about Naruto, she had hoped to do so in a more relaxed state. "I guess that's not happening." "Well, Lady Tsunade, there were some strange incidents that took place during the mission and I was hoping to speak with you and get your opinion on them. However, considering the subject involved in these incidents, I wasn't sure how to broach speaking with you." At this, Tsunade raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Am I correct in guessing that this subject is Naruto?" Seeing the Junin flinch was all the answer she needed. "Kurenai, if it involves Naruto in any way, don't ever be afraid to come to me. If there's a problem with him, I would want to solve it immediately, because even if I don't say it, that knucklehead's important to me. Actually, Lady Tsunade, that's part of the reason I found it so hard to discuss this with you," Kurenai began. Naruto was acting very strange during the entire length of the mission. He was a complete 180 from what one would expect from him. He was like a totally different person, milady. "So, what you're telling me is, instead of being hyperactive, loud, and everything else we know the shrimp to be, Naruto acted like a competent ninja should?" Kurenai could hear the underlying question in her Hokage's tone. "Why are you questioning a miracle? Lady Tsunade, I know how it sounds, But you didn't experience it. This Naruto wasn't just acting as a competent ninja, he was acting like a leader. This sparked Tsunade's interest, and she asked her Junin to explain herself. While Kurenai and Ino tried to decipher the new Naruto, the subject of their mystery was on his way home. If I'm right, Ino and Kurenai-sensei should be talking with Tsunade Bakken about my change. Well, go ahead and let her. She has no real understanding of what's really going. Nor does she have the foresight to see what's coming. But I can't do it alone, I'll need help, and I'll start tomorrow with Hinata. Coming out of his thoughts, Naruto realized he'd made it to his apartment building. Walking up the steps, the blonde traversed the familiar, silent halls of doors until finally coming to the room he'd been given. Entering into his apartment, Naruto took notice that nothing had been defaced while he was gone, this time, and made his way to his bedroom. Naruto walked over to his bed, and sat the rucksack down on the mattress before removing the cloth bundle from around his chest and setting it beside it on the bed. First, he opened up the pack and began to pull out the first part of his order, his armor. Naruto's armor was an almost exact replica of the armor he'd seen in his dream and in the temple, only this set was fitted to his smaller stature, something I'll have to rectify quickly. Piece by piece he removed the armor, the steel greaves for his shins, the leather teruge for around his waist, a steel cuirass with leather lappets at the shoulders and leather shoulder pads. The last piece of metal he pulled from the pack was an officer's helmet with red horsehair running from front to back. After setting aside the armor, Naruto reached back inside and removed a set of leather wrist bracers, a blood-red tunic to be worn under the armor, a faux scarf, to be worn so he could avoid chafing from the cuirass rubbing against his neck, and at the bottom, sat a pair of leather boots. These were all hung up in his closet and his armor was left on the bed until he could get a mannequin to set it up on. With his wardrobe pulled from the rucksack, Naruto opened two other pockets and pulled out a set of books from each, Caesar's military journals. And finally, from out of his jacket pocket, he pulled the lineage log. After stashing his books in his dresser, Naruto turned to the bundle of cloth still wrapped up on his bed. This was the second part of his request to Shuichi. Ino and Choji had been watching their third team member for over 20 minutes. After the first 5, Ino had decided to sit down. They'd almost assumed he'd fallen asleep, and were about to shake him, when Shikamaru's eyes flew open. Ino was the first to react. "So, what did you figure out?" "Nothing," Shikamaru grumbled out, obviously upset he wasn't able to solve the mystery. "What do you mean nothing? How can you have no idea about why Naruto's acting so weird?" Her accusatory tone irked the Nara. "I have no idea because not only did you not give me enough information, I wasn't there to experience this new Naruto, okay?" Ino was definitely not okay. If her brainy teammate couldn't tell her what was going on, then she felt she was doomed to never know. And Ino Yamanaka hated not knowing something. "I may just have to take a more hands-on approach to this mystery," she thought, but her idea was quickly put to grass. "Ino, don't even think about it. If Naruto's really just done a complete 180, I don't think it'd be a good idea for you to go snooping around. There's no telling how he'd react. I'll do it." This caused the Yamanaka heiress' eyes to widen. "You? Since when do you do recon, Shikamaru?" "Well, normally I don't, but considering the circumstances, I'm the only one who can." This new Naruto sounds like he's got some skill. Wordplay, so the person investigating him is to be able to keep up. And out of the 3 of us, I'm the only one who could. No offense, Choji. The aforementioned boy threw out a "none taken." With that said, Shikamaru stood up, dusted himself off, and walked off in search of Naruto. So you see, Lady Tsunade, I'm not sure what to make of this new Naruto. Normally his change in attitude would be considered a good thing, but the suddenness as well as the secretive way he's been acting, even towards comrades, is a little off-putting, milady. For the past few minutes Kurenai replayed all of Naruto's strange behavior to the women who sat in front of her, in hopes of making some kind of sense out of the blonde's strange behavior. "Well, Ms. Yuhi, that's some interesting information you've given me. However, again, I can't give my sound opinion because I have yet to witness Naruto's change firsthand. But rest assured, I plan to call him in, as I have things I need to speak with him about, and after I get a read on his new attitude I will let you know my thoughts." How does that sound? Kurenai, although not entirely happy with the outcome, understood that it was the best she was going to get. So with a "thank you," Kurenai turned, and exited Tsunade's office. Tsunade sat in her chair, fingers once again steepled in front of her face, and asked her Enbu hiding in the shadows to leave her to her thoughts. Once they were gone, she spoke. So, what do you think about what Kurenai said, Jiraiya? Out from the shadows a tall man with a mane of white hair phased into sight. Jiraiya was, like Tsunade, a member of Konoha's legendary Sannin. He was a tall man, standing about 6 feet tall. His snow-white hair was as long as the man was tall, the majority of it being held in a ponytail. He was dressed in a short-sleeved, olive-green kimono top with matching pants. Underneath this he wore mesh body armor that showed out of the sleeves of his shirt and legs of his pants. Over top of this he wore a red haori. Instead of a traditional forehead protector, his had a horn on either side and the kanji for oil in the center. Also, instead of traditional ninja sandals, the Sannin wore red geta. Well, Tsunade Heim, I'm in the same boat as you in this matter. I'd have to experience it firsthand. But from the tone of your Junin's voice this change in attitude should be watched closely. Do you know where the kid is now? Tsunade shook her head. Unfortunately no, at the moment I have no idea where he is. I guess the first place to look would be his apartment, and if not there then the ramen stand he frequents. Other than those two places I'm not sure where else he'd be. Jiraiya took all this in and told Tsunade he'd personally keep an eye on their godson. Then, silently, he made the decision to have some of his spy network go over to Wave Country, and see if they could find. I know this wasn't much of a conversation, I just wanted to open the door for Jiraiya to come into play for later. Naruto slowly unwrapped the bundle of cloth, his heart beginning to pick up speed at the anticipation of seeing his final gift. He was not forced to wait long. Once fully unwrapped, Naruto stared down at the weapon nestled on the bed of silk. His very own gladius. The blade itself was only about 2 feet. In length, its body double-edged with a triangle tip. Along its outer edge was the inscription, Veni, Vidi, Vici. Which Naruto learned meant, I came, I saw, I conquered. And conquer I shall. Naruto thought as he turned his eyes down to look at the hilt. The hilt was made of ivory, with indents for the fingers for better grip, while the pommel as well as the guard were made of hardwood. It truly was a masterpiece. Next his eyes landed on the smaller blade next to it, the Pugio dagger. The Pugio's blade held more of a curve than the gladius, and was about half its length, but that didn't make the sidearm any less dangerous. Naruto remembered when he'd first decided to have them fashioned. Flashback. Naruto stood staring at the blacksmith in front of him. After making his request Naruto had returned the very next day to check on its progress. He was unprepared for what awaited him. He walked into Suichi's shop, the sound of hammer meeting metal the first thing to greet his ears. He walked to the back of the shop, behind the bamboo curtain-style door, and was then greeted with the sight of his chosen blacksmith pounding away at a slab of hot metal laying on top of an anvil. How stereotypical, Naruto thought to himself. Naruto waited patiently for the man to finish, so as not to distract him from his work. Once Suichi placed the metal into the tub of water and placed it back on the anvil, the blonde spoke up. It's nice to see you hard at work, Suichi-san. The sudden extra voice visibly startled the man. Ah, Imperator, forgive me for not noticing your presence earlier. If I had, I would have surely stopped to attend you. Your apology is not needed, I stood by so as not to disturb you while you worked. After all, how would you be able to finish on time if I interrupt you in the middle of your work? Speaking of which, how are you coming along? Suichi swallowed the lump in his throat before answering. It's coming along rather quickly, Imperator. I have no doubt that I will be able to finish it all in the allotted time. Naruto took these words in with great satisfaction and was unable to hide it, something I will no doubt need to work on, he thought. Naruto had come to the conclusion that he'd need to learn how to keep his emotions in check if he wanted to bring honor to the name, Caesar. Naruto had been so deep in his self-beating tat he almost missed Suichi speaking with him. Excuse me, Imperator, Naruto stopped him. Naruto-sama, that is how you will address me for now, I do not yet have the standing to be considered your Imperator. Forgive me. As I was saying, Naruto-sama, do you have your weapons forged yet? This threw Naruto for a loop. Naruto had not actually given thought to weapons, but thinking about it now he realized something. If he wants to resurrect the Roman Empire, and honor his ancestor, Naruto would have to do it right. That meant no jutsu, just pure military might, and that meant weapons. As a matter of fact, no, I hadn't even thought of weapons, Suichi. But now that you've informed me, would you be up to the task of making those weapons for me? Suichi again saw the underlying meaning behind this request. The weapons he would forge for the blonde in front of him would be the same ones used to carve out the first steps of the new world. Oh, of course, Naruto-sama. Although it will take me considerably longer than 2 days due to the wait that will come with ordering the necessary metal, as well as material for the hilt. Naruto stood there, arms crossed in front of his chest, and thought of what he'd just been told. On the one hand he did require the weapons, but on the other hand he wasn't sure of how long he would be staying. About how long would these materials need to get here, and then how long would you take to make the weapons? Well, the materials would take about 3 to 4 days after I've ordered them, and then to craft the weapons will be about another 2 days, Naruto-sama. Seeing no real way to speed up the process, Naruto was forced to accept the terms and allow Suichi to return to his current task of forging Naruto's armor. With the placement of his unexpected addition to his order finished, Naruto turned and exited the shop and returned to Tezuna's home, where he would go up to his room and read through the first military journal. End flashback. When Naruto had arrived at the bridge ready to depart from Wave, he'd almost thought Suichi had been unable to finish his request on time. But now, looking at the craftsmanship of the weapons, and the ornate design of his dagger's sheath, Naruto managed to forgive the blacksmith for his tardiness, this time. Quickly writing a letter that he'd send back to the man later, Naruto then contemplated how to spend the next part of his day. Deciding he wanted to get a feel for his new tools, Naruto removed his thick orange jacket, leaving him in his blue shirt, and strapped the blades to his body, the gladius strap going across his chest with the blade hanging off his right hip, and the pugio sheathed at his left hip, its strap around his waist like a belt. After finishing getting ready, Naruto set up some clones to watch his house, and set off on his way towards the training fields. Naruto calmly made his way to the training field, practicing his Roman swagger as he went. His right hand rested on his sword pommel while his left, clutched into a fist, swung lightly as he walked, his strides holding purpose as Naruto held his head high, back straight, and chest out. While the blonde made his way through the village streets, he began to feel like he was being watched. Turning a corner, Naruto stopped, turned around, and waited for his shadow to follow after him. He did not have to wait long. Within minutes a small body collided into Naruto's chest. Looking down, the blonde's cobalt eyes were greeted by a head of spiky, brown hair held back by a set of green goggles. It was Konohamaru. Konohamaru looked up and, to his surprise, was greeted by the face of his boss. The academy student had thought he was doing well in tailing his mentor, but apparently not well enough. Hey boss, I see you're back from your mission. How'd that go anyway? Naruto, on the other hand, was not amused. What do you want, Konohamaru? I'm about to head to the training field, so I don't have time to play today. Konohamaru shook his head. I wasn't gonna ask you to come play, boss. I was gonna see if you had any time to train me. Maybe show me another jutsu? The boy's eyes held a look of hope, as well as fear that his idol would decline. Naruto thought about, and at first was going to decline, but then saw the possibilities behind teaching his student the way of the Roman, as well as the new way of Naruto. This has the potential to be very rewarding. Alright Konohamaru, you can come to the training field with me, but only if you're willing to take this seriously. If I feel that you aren't trying your hardest, I'll send you home, understand? So the two continued their trek to the training grounds, this time side by side. As Naruto continued to practice his Roman swagger, the young pre-genin at his side took notice, and tried to imitate his idol. Said idol took notice and smirked inwardly to himself. This is already looking promising. Soon they arrived and Naruto began some basic stretches. Once again, Konohamaru copied his teacher and attempted the stretches. After loosening up, Naruto decided it was time to begin. First, he unsheathed his sidearm and tossed it at the young boy's feet. Then he drew his gladius and spoke. Pick that up, I'm beginning to learn Kenjutsu and I figure it wouldn't hurt for you to have another skill under your belt before you graduate. Konohamaru did as instructed, although with the Pugio being heavier than a standard kunai, it was accomplished with difficulty. Once it was successfully pulled from the ground, the boy looked to his mentor for further guidance. What he saw confused him. Naruto had settled into a bizarre sword stance. His body was turned, with his head turned towards his opponent. His arms were raised to the side of his face and his blade was directed at the opponent in front of him. I hope you're ready, because my first lesson is, don't ever hold back, you must press attack until you've won. Konohamaru stood there, unsure of what to do in the face of his mentor's battle stance. What did I say? Always press attack. Hearing his instructions again, this time the academy student charged at his idol, hands raised above his head and his sword leaning back towards the ground due to gravity. When he got within striking distance he began to pull the blade forward, but was forced to jump to the side in order to avoid the jab Naruto sent at his face. Unfortunately, the weight of the Pugio threw off his center of gravity, and Konohamaru was sent tumbling onto his backside. This left him unprepared for the foot that came down at him, leaving Konohamaru just enough time to throw up his arms in an X-block and wind up on his back. When the boy opened his eyes he was met with the tip of Naruto's gladius, and cobalt eyes gleaming with disappointment. That was awful. Konohamaru, don't ever charge at your opponent like that. As you just experienced, it leaves you extremely vulnerable, and just as bad, leaves you off balance. Your next mistake. Don't ever let go of your weapon, because if you do, you're dead. Hearing these harsh words from his idol made the young academy student lower his head in shame. I am sorry boss, I wasn't thinking. At this he turned his eyes up at his mentor and pleaded, please, don't make me go home. I'll get it, I promise, just give me another chance. Seeing his student so dedicated to learning, and making Naruto proud, made the blonde reconsider his earlier thought of actually sending the kid home. Alright, you get one more chance to prove that you're serious about this. If you do well then your training will continue, if not, then don't ever broach the subject with me again. Konohamaru's eyes filled with hope, and then steeled in determination at his mentor's final words. I can't afford to mess up again. Getting back on his feet, the boy picked the Pugio up and returned to his starting position. This time, instead of rushing in, Konohamaru entered into the same stance he'd seen his teacher in moments before. However, when he went to pull his blade parallel to his face, he could feel his arms shake underneath the unusual weight. But he forced himself to hold firm and not look weak in front of Naruto. So there the two stood, staring each other down and waiting to see who'd make the first move. Again, Konohamaru struck first, but this time far less recklessly. He brought his sword down and broke into a run. When he felt close enough he performed a ground roll, and when he returned to his feet, swung out at Naruto's right leg. But Naruto, acting on reflex, lifted his leg and avoided the attack, and then once again swung out with his leg and this time managed to connect with the boy's cheek. Konohamaru was sent rolling from the kick, but managed to get a hand flat on the ground, and pushed himself into an uneasy kneeling position. However, he didn't get to rebalance himself as his mentor was already upon him, sword coming down in a horizontal slash. Konohamaru was the one to act on instinct this time as raised the Pugio up and tried to block. Because the blade was swiftly knocked from his hand, before he was met with a viscous back fist that sprawled him out on the grass. Quickly setting aside the throbbing pain in his jaw, Konohamaru sat up on his knees and searched for his weapon. When he didn't see it he looked to his teacher. Naruto stood now with his gladius returned to its sheath and his sidearm clutched at his side in a reverse grip. He also wore a small smile on his face aimed directly at Konohamaru. You did better. When I was harsh before you must understand, while I don't expect you to be a match for a member of the Anbu on your first practice, I still expect a degree of focus and level-headedness that you did not show the first round. Konohamaru visibly winced at the mention of his first attempt. But the second time around I noticed you adopted my defensive stance, as well as thought out your plan of attack before engaging me. Hearing the praise of his mentor and role model, the academy student's face split into an ear-to-ear smile, before swiftly returning to normal, and Konohamaru's hand reaching up at his newly bruised face. Tears started to well in his eyes, but the boy forced them back so as to again avoid looking weak in front of Naruto. Konohamaru's actions did not go unnoticed. Naruto saw that the boy had tried multiple times during the course of their training session to keep up a strong and devoted front. Something the blonde felt would come in handy, and is something he could use to help the boy become stronger. For now though, hey, Konohamaru, how about you and I go and get something to eat? As a reward for doing so well during our second go-around, you can choose where we eat. Konohamaru, although excited at the prospect of eating at his favorite restaurant, decided that he'd rather have a different reward. As much as that would rock, boss, could I maybe use my reward to have us keep training? The boy's request shocked Naruto at first, but then he realized that he'd just found a very useful asset. Well, if that's what you want, sure. Like I said, I'm new to this as well, and I need all the practice I can get right now, so it'll be good to at least get a feel for handling my blade. This brought on a question that Konohamaru had kept in the back of his mind. Hey boss, what kind of sword is that? I don't think I've seen or learned about it. Jiraiya sat shocked. Jiraiya wasn't entirely sure what to do with this new information. Without the input of knowledge his spy network would get from Wave in a few days, the Sannin was left with an incomplete picture. And then there's those strange weapons and fighting stance. The kid said that the weapons are from the time before the Sage, so maybe the stances as well. I think, if I could get more information on the weapons and the stance, I might be able to put together more of this puzzle. And what was with that slip-up earlier? What was he about to really say? With that thought, the Sannin disappeared in a swirl of leaves to report back to Tsunade. Shikamaru's ears and eyes must have been deceiving him, because there was no way that the blonde practicing in the training field was the Naruto he'd met back in the academy. Naruto was parrying blows, sidestepping slashes, and just using a sword in a way he'd never expected the clumsy Uzumaki capable of. Sure, he wasn't perfect, but the natural talent was clear to see. Shikamaru had gone from Naruto's house immediately to the training grounds with the original goal being to skip straight to the end of his search and just try again tomorrow, but he never thought he'd encounter something like the spectacle that played out before him. Like Naruto, Konohamaru also seemed to possess a natural talent for swordplay, as he performed various ducks and rolls before turning them into deadly slashes and even upward thrusts. But it was obvious that, due to his young age, he'd have some catching up to do if he wanted to be considered a competent sword user. But still, the fact that both of them possess such skill already is mind-boggling. And then the Nara recalled what he'd originally been sent out to investigate. Ino was right, Naruto's almost a completely different person now. I mean, sure, he's still got some of that old, Academy Naruto, in him, but not to the point anymore where it'd be considered annoying. In fact, I'd be hard-pressed not to call it charismatic. I still don't have enough information, like what he and Tazuna spoke of or where he spent most of his time on the mission. And then to top it off, he's using some ancient weapons and an unknown kenjutsu stance. I think if I can learn about those it'll give me an idea of what went on in Wave, and more importantly, what sparked this new attitude. Putting such questions aside, the Nara heir returned his eyes to the spar in front of him. Naruto stood, Gladius at his side, and stared across the field at his sparring partner. Konohamaru stood on shaking legs, Pugio held firmly in his hand. The boy was covered in bruises, grass and dirt stains littered his clothes, and a rivulet of dried blood hung out the corner of his mouth. He'd taken more hits than he'd managed to give, but at this thought he smiled, but I did manage to get in some hits. True to form, Naruto had shallow cuts on both legs and even a relatively nice one on his right arm. Due to the blonde being unprepared for an assault above his stomach, Naruto had returned to his ready stance, eyes following Konohamaru as the boy paced from side to side, looking for an opening and thinking about his plan of attack. As he should be, Naruto noticed a change in his student's eyes and tensed his muscles in anticipation for his attack. Moments later his readiness was rewarded. Konohamaru noticed a slight glaze in his mentor's eyes, taking this as a sign he'd momentarily dropped his guard. The boy ran in. When he got within correct distance, instead of rolling, Konohamaru shifted his weight to his left foot and jumped with it. Naruto, who'd been expecting the roll, was surprised when the boy leapt into the air and performed a horizontal slash at his chest. Thinking quickly, and forgetting that he'd foregone wearing his leather bracers, the blonde raised his arm and parried the blow. He followed this with a swift punch to the back of Konohamaru's head, and then jumping back to assess the damage. Konohamaru, although now with a face full of grass and dirt, couldn't hold back a smile at surprising his mentor and landing such an attack. While Naruto thought about his student's clever tactic, across the field the young Sarutobi's mind was on how tired that last assault had made him. Konohamaru decided he would go one more round before calling it quits for the day. So I better make this one count. The young Sarutobi, deciding on his initial attack plan, rushed forward to engage his mentor in a final round of swordplay. He started with a sweep slash, then, anticipating Naruto's jump back, Konohamaru used the momentum from his spin and turned it into a jab. Naruto parried his jab and struck with his fist, which caught the momentarily off-guard Konohamaru in the cheek. When Naruto went to press his attack with a Spartan kick, the academy student ducked under it and went to graze his mentor's unprotected side with his blade. Deciding that he'd done enough for one day, Konohamaru leapt back and dropped to his knees. Naruto noticed his student retreat and realized he'd had enough for the day. Sheathing his gladius, Naruto walked over to Konohamaru's kneeling form. "You did well today, I'm proud of you, Konohamaru. When we started I wasn't sure if you were going to be able to handle the seriousness of the training, but you surprised me, and I think I'm going to enjoy teaching you." The blonde's words made Konohamaru's pride swell and his eyes shine with happiness. "Do you really mean that, boss? I mean, I didn't really do very well, and I kept retreating without ever making you retreat once. Hey, that's not important. We're both just starting out, so I'm not expecting either of us to be top-notch fighters just yet. You managed to hold your own, and even get in a few blows on me, that's what matters right now. And, in time, you will improve and become a force to be reckoned with." Naruto allowed a sincere smile to ghost across his lips, just enough to be noticeable, and said, "Now that training's over, how about we—" The blonde was cut off by the sound of leaves rustling. Shit. He heard me leaving. Okay, calm down, I'll just make it look like I stumbled on them. It works out I guess, but I really wish our meeting would have been under better circumstances." Shikamaru thought as he stood stock still behind his tree. After it looked like the two were done training, Shikamaru decided he'd go home and formulate his wordplay strategy when he searched out Naruto the following day. But he'd been too noisy in his retreat. So, the young Nara stepped out from his hiding space and, doing his best to shove away the nervousness, spoke up. "Hey Naruto, sorry if I was interrupting anything. I was just trying to find you so I could ask you about your mission to Wave." "Why did I just say that?" the Nara heir thought in a panic. Naruto's cobalt eyes hardened at the sound of the other boy's statement. "Why do you want to ask me about my mission? I don't remember you ever being interested in anything I've done before, so why now? What made this particular mission so interesting?" The blonde wasn't sure, but he thought he saw a bead of sweat roll down Shikamaru's face. Sigh, I might as well tell him. Damn it all, how could I let myself be caught off guard like this? "Well, Ino was going on and on about how you apparently have your own bridge, with statues and everything, and how nice the place looked now. I found it a little hard to believe, you know how Ino is, so I figured you'd be the best person to ask about whether what she said was true or not." Naruto stared into his fellow graduate's eyes for what seemed like an eternity, his cobalt gaze searching, looking for the real reason for Shikamaru's visit. While he found something, he couldn't fully identify it before Konohamaru spoke up. Boss, we can go get food tomorrow if it's okay. My mom probably wants me home, I didn't exactly tell her where I was going today. And besides, you should catch up with your friend." Konohamaru began to exit the training ground, stopping to find out what time he should show up tomorrow, then continued on his way home. Now the two ninja were alone. Shikamaru felt uncomfortable standing there alone with Naruto. Had this been a number of weeks ago, the Nara was sure this feeling wouldn't exist, but now, he wasn't sure just what it was he was dealing with. Naruto, on the other hand, recognized the opportunity that he'd just been presented. With Konohamaru gone, Naruto was now able to jump ahead with his plans. After readying himself, Naruto spoke. "Shikamaru, I know why you're really here." The aforementioned boy's eyes widened in shock. "Ino told you about my strange behavior in Wave, and you wanted to see for yourself." "It's okay, ya no, I just wish you'd been more straightforward with me." Naruto's tone, as well as his understanding for Shikamaru's spying, surprised the young clan heir. He'd been expecting harsh words and icy stares, but instead he was presented with the man before him. Well, Ino was right about one thing, Naruto's definitely changed. "And Naruto, if I offended you, I didn't mean it. It's just that Ino wouldn't stop talking about how strange you'd been acting, and then she said she was gonna come and question you, but since I wasn't sure how you'd react I told I'd come and talk to you. Naruto, I'm not judging you or telling you to go back to how you were, I'm just curious." Shikamaru had never been in this position before, and so he was unprepared to handle it. Naruto was calm on the outside, But inside the wolf was snarling. Ino, that nosy bitch. I was so focused on throwing off Kurenai-sensei that I forgot about Ino and her habit of sticking her nose in other people's business. Damn it all, how could I have been so stupid? My plans haven't even had time to begin and already I'm going to have to deal with a loose end. I'm just lucky it's only Ino, she'll be easy to handle. Making plans to handle his fellow blonde later, Naruto returned his attention to his current predicament, getting Shikamaru on his side. Shikamaru, like I said, it's okay. I understand you're just looking out for a friend, and why wouldn't you? Ino's such a nice, smart, beautiful girl, and I know you'd never want anything bad to happen to her. Even if it was just a scolding for her nosy tendencies. But rest assured, I have no plans to harm or be aggressive towards your teammate. Hearing this put the young Chunin's mind more at ease, but was still curious about a few things, so he decided to broach the subject. I'm glad to hear that. I've been meaning to ask, Naruto, what's up with the new weapons? Well, I picked them up when I was in Wave Country on that mission. The longer blade on my right hip is called a gladius, and this shorter one on my left hip is known as a pugio. Both are from a time before the Sage of Six Paths, when people fought with real skill and not just flashy jutsus. But you already knew that part, didn't you? Shikamaru, if you actually want to know about my weapons all you have to do is ask. I won't lie to you. Although Naruto didn't actually know that Shikamaru had been watching him, the blonde took a gamble and watched to see the Chunin's reaction. He wasn't disappointed. Shikamaru visibly flinched. I thought he hadn't noticed till just a few minutes ago, and spoke up. You're right, Naruto. I should have just asked. Can you tell me a little more about them? Like where they're from maybe? Bingo, there's the question I've been waiting for. It's okay, Shikamaru. These weapons are from an ancient empire known as Rome, although Rome itself was just a small city, but it grew into an empire by annexing other cities and villages. The gladius was the main weapon of choice for their soldiers, while the pugio was the sidearm. The gladius was mainly a thrusting weapon but could be used to slash as well. Apparently, Rome became one of the small elemental countries after the sage came along and introduced chakra. Whirlpool, I think the name was. Something about the name, Whirlpool, clicked in Shikamaru's mind. Although not entirely sure where he'd heard it, the shadow manipulator was positive he had. I'll go and talk to Dad about it. I think I've got enough information to start putting together this puzzle. Well, Naruto, thank you for alleviating my worries about Ino, and for telling me as much as you did. I know you didn't have to, and it's nice to know you trust me with stuff like this. Unfortunately, I have to get going. Otherwise I run the risk of angering my mother. I was supposed to help care for the deer today. Naruto nodded in understanding. It's fine, Shikamaru, you go ahead. I have some other things I need to do today. And in regards to the information, I know I can trust you with it. With another nod, Shikamaru turned and exited the training grounds, completely missing the sly smile that slipped into place on Naruto's face. Shikamaru's mind was a storm of questions. After leaving Naruto at the training ground, the young Chunin's mind had been plagued by questions about just what all the information, along with Naruto's new attitude, could mean. Knowing that he was still at a disadvantage without knowing what Naruto found on his mission to Wave, Shikamaru decided the only real option was to speak with his father about Whirlpool, and hopefully, Rome. But Naruto said he trusted me, so doesn't that mean going to my dad with this information is a violation of that trust? Or maybe, he meant it in that he trusted me not to give out this information to just anyone, like Ino or even Choji. His resolve re-strengthened, Shikamaru continued on through the village, and headed home, where I hope I can get some more answers. Shikamaru walked into his home and was met with a common sound, his parents arguing. Rather than sit and wait for something that could take hours, the young shadow manipulator walked into his living room and interrupted his mother's tirade. Hey, Dad, I need to talk to you. I've been given some interesting information, and was hoping you could help me sort through it? Shikaku Nara was an almost older copy of Shikamaru. The only real difference being the scars on his face and the facial hair he had on his chin. Sure son, we can go out by the deer and talk. So father and son walked off, leaving an enraged Nara matriarch that both men knew they'd be dealing with later. Once outside, Shikamaru's stomach began to do flips. He began to question whether telling his father was a good idea, but then the thought of leaving the puzzle unfinished goaded the young man into speaking. Dad, what can you tell me about Whirlpool Country? Shikaku, who had been expecting any myriad of things, was unprepared for his son's question. He hadn't been expecting his son to bring up a destroyed old village, and his shock showed in his response. Why do you want to know about Whirlpool, son? That village has been deserted for years, no one's even set foot on its soil since the country itself was destroyed. I'm curious because I talked with Naruto today and he'd mentioned it. He also told me that the village also used to be called Rome, which had been a vast empire back before the Sage of Six Paths introduced chakra to the world. Now Shikaku's interest had really been struck. How had Naruto learned of his mother's home, and more importantly, how had he learned of its ancient history? Shikamaru, how did Naruto come across this knowledge exactly? I know they only mention the land of whirlpools in passing at the academy, and there aren't any books about it in any of the libraries, so where did young Naruto learn of the village's existence? The Nara heir was a little disturbed to know that, not just a single village, but an entire country had been stricken from history. But, knowing that he had to push that information to the side for now, Shikamaru answered. He went on a mission to Wave Country recently, and I guess, he learned of it there. He also returned with some weapons that he says are the same types of weapons those ancient Romans used. A gladius and pugio, I think they were called. Really, he had weapons fashioned for himself? Well, Shikamaru, I suppose I can tell you a little bit about what you want to know. For starters, did you know that the Nara clan is able to trace its roots back to the time of the Roman Empire? The young Chunin's eyes widened at this. Yep, but we weren't always referred to as Nara. Our house name used to be Crassus. And one ancestor in particular was extremely well known. His name was Marcus Crassus, and he was a part of something known as the Triumvirate, along with two other Romans. What's a triumvirate, and who were the other two members? Well, a triumvirate is a political power, I guess you could call it. As its name says, it's made up of three men, usually the three most influential men in an area. The triumvirate I'm speaking of was made up of our ancestor Marcus Crassus, a general by the name of Pompey Magnus, and another man named Julius Caesar. For some reason, hearing the name Caesar caused a knot to form in the young Shikamaru's stomach. Ino sat in her parents' flower shop, bored to tears. She'd gone home after her talk with Shikamaru and was met by her parents, both looking ready to leave. They told her that she would be responsible for the shop for the rest of the day, as the two of them had work to do. Her father in the T&I department, her mother a trip to another village. So, after they left, Ino cleaned up and changed into an orange t-shirt that stopped above her navel along with a pair of white shorts that stopped mid-thigh. Normally the young kunoichi didn't mind tending the shop, and at times even enjoyed it, but with only a handful of customers that day, and the still unsolved mystery of the new Naruto, Ino wanted to be anywhere but the flower shop. Her attention was then turned to the door as its signal bell rang. Hello and welcome to. The young blonde was silenced by the figure standing at the door. Naruto. Naruto, what are you doing in a flower shop? Hoping to find a gift for Sakura, I suppose? Her guess was met with a light chuckle. No, in fact, I've come to the conclusion that Sakura is not worth chasing anymore. I've actually come by to talk to you, Ino. Ino was a little unnerved by the tone of her fellow blonde's voice near the end of his statement. He sounded upset. Listen, Naruto, if you're here to ask me out, I'm gonna. Naruto didn't give her the chance to finish. Why are you snooping around my business, Ino? By this time Naruto had locked the door and flipped the open sign to closed. And don't bother denying it, Shikamaru already gave you up. All I want to know is, why? If you're not interested in me, then I see no reason you'd take such a sudden interest in anything I do. Naruto had rounded the counter by this time, and was backing Ino against the wall, where a tall shelf that stored arrangement displays the two blondes from view of people on the street. Ino's face erupted into a fierce blush at how close Naruto was to her. She had put up her hands to stop his advance, and without his bulky orange jacket she could feel his developing muscles, and couldn't stop herself from lightly groping the boy's pectoral muscles. In spite of how she acted, Ino had never had any experience with a guy. She tried to look away and put together a believable excuse, but she couldn't pull her eyes away from Naruto's smoldering, cobalt gaze. Wait, is his face getting closer? Naruto's face was getting closer. He brought his lips up to the young heiress' ear and spoke again. Ino, you wound me. I'd be more than happy to enlighten you about not only what I was doing in Wave, but also my new attitude. All I need from you is Naruto had brought his hands up and was lightly ghosting his fingers up and down her bare sides. Silence. I don't want you running around and telling everybody about what I'm going to tell you, alright? Naruto pulled away from Ino's ear, but now he was close enough that their noses brushed against one another. He brought his right hand up, the left still occupied with massaging Ino's side, and cupped her face in its palm. His hands are so warm. The platinum blonde didn't know what to do. She felt like she was getting ready to slink to the floor. Naruto's breath on her ear had caused her knees to shake. The hand massaging her bare side formed a pool of heat in her stomach and a lump in her throat. No longer was she trying to hide her feeling along his torso. Her hands had minds of their own. She was drawn from her euphoric feeling by Naruto speaking again. We can talk more about this tomorrow when you won't be so busy. Naruto completely pulled away and began walking towards the door. Once he reached it and was about to leave, he said, "Oh, and if those lips of yours can't keep quiet, I'm sure we can find other things to occupy their time with." And with that he exited the store and began to walk home. Back in the store, Ino, released from the spell of Naruto's eyes, finally gave up and fell to the floor. Naruto was extremely proud of himself. He hadn't expected his meeting with Ino to go so well. He'd found another skill he had that he could use to persuade people to his side. After Shikamaru left him at the training ground, Naruto had been trying to come up with a way to deal with Ino. Every idea he came up with at first involved intimidation and/or physical harm, but he knew he wasn't well versed in intimidation yet, and any physical means would be noticed by others. He'd almost gotten to the flower shop, and was going to try intimidating her. No time to try like the present, when he saw them. He noticed a young civilian couple standing outside a shop flirting. The boy had his girlfriend held lightly against the store's wall, and was speaking into her ear while lightly kissing and biting her neck. Naruto stood and stared for a moment before a wolfish smile made its way onto his face again. I know exactly how to handle this, the blonde thought to himself as he made to enter the shop. With his problem with Ino handled, Naruto could now go home and focus on how he could put this new skill to use during his talk with Hinata the next morning. Everything seems to be coming together quite nicely. The sun rose, signaling the start of a new day, and one of the first people up to greet it was Hinata Hyuga. The young heiress awoke with a smile on her face. The dream she'd had was a very pleasant one. Getting up and stretching, Hinata remembered that today she was going to be spending time with her Naruto-kun. I wonder what he wants to talk about. After performing her morning rituals, Hinata exited the clan compound and began walking to her team's training ground. As usual, she was the first one to arrive, so she decided to perform some stretches while she waited. As she performed a split, then reached forward to touch her toes, Hinata sensed that she was being watched. Staying in her current position, she activated her Byakugan and scanned the area. Hinata quickly turned off her dojutsu and gasped. It was Naruto. After a short rustling of the leaves, the blue-eyed blonde entered into the clearing and waited for the young kunoichi to face him. Hinata finished her current stretch and stood to address her Naruto-kun. Good morning, Naruto-kun. Is there something you needed? I was under the impression that our meeting would be taking place after my morning training. It still is. I just wanted to come by before your team got here and see you, if that's alright? I know it sounds strange, but I was feeling off this morning, and at first, I couldn't understand why. But then I realized what was missing. Like with Ino, Naruto had gotten close enough that he was able to wrap his arms around the brunette's waist. I hadn't seen you yet. I'd gotten so used to waking up to your beautiful face in the morning during that mission, that I don't think my day will ever be right again without seeing you. Hinata's face burned a new shade of red at not only the close proximity of her Naruto-kun, but also his loving words that were amplified by the heart-stopping look in his eyes. She brought her hands up, like Ino had done, and was greeted by the same muscled chest that she'd experienced too. The biggest difference was, Hinata didn't try to hide her explorations. Naruto felt this, but didn't mind if it helped solidify his hold on the young heiress. His coming out this early was another gamble, something I seemed to be doing a lot lately, but it seemed to be bearing favorable results. While I love that I've gotten to see you this morning, I should get going before your sensei shows up. I don't think she liked me very much. But I'll be by again in a few hours to get you, okay? Hinata, voice failing her, just nodded her head. Naruto decided to leave the girl with something to hang off of, and leaned down to place a kiss on her cheek. Then, the blonde let the girl go and walked off. Hinata couldn't believe it. Her Naruto-kun had come just to see her, said he loved seeing her, and even given her a kiss. Sure, it was on the cheek, but it was a kiss nonetheless. He'd even held her in such an intimate position. Finally, with all the excitement colliding at once, Hinata fainted with a smile on her face. The rest of Team 8 finally arrived and, after waking Hinata, commenced with their training session. It was quickly learned that a happy Hinata was a productive Hinata. Her spars were quick, she defeated both Shino and Kiba swiftly, taking virtually no time at all. This strange increase in skill intrigued Kurenai. She wanted to test the girl herself. Alright Hinata, since you've done so well so far, how about you and I spar? I know I usually only spar with Kiba and Shino, but you seem to be on your A-game today and I'd be a fool not to test you at your best. What do you say? That would be great Kurenai-sensei, thank you. While on the outside Hinata seemed excited, on the inside she was frowning. It was true, Kurenai had sparred solely with her two male teammates, and any time Hinata asked to spar the Genjutsu mistress would say, "I'm not sure you're really up to it yet Hinata. I know you'll hold back, and I don't want to risk seriously injuring you." How was she supposed to get stronger, and show her Naruto-kun her strength, if her teacher refused to help her? Hinata walked over to her side of the field and entered into her gentle fist stance, Byakugan eyes blazing. Kurenai barely had any time to settle into a stance before the young heiress rushed her. Kurenai sidestepped a palm thrust and retaliated with a right cross. Hinata ducked under her sensei's counterattack, and spinning on the ball of her foot, sent a roundhouse kick into the red-eyed woman's stomach, sending her back a few steps. Deciding to press her advantage, Hinata once again rushed forward with a palm strike. Kurenai was shocked when her student managed to evade her attack and then turn it into a counterattack. Before she could check the damage to her stomach, the Junin was again forced to evade a palm thrust, only this time it was followed up by Hinata taking hold of Kurenai's arm and tossing the woman over her shoulder. Again the red-eyed Junin's eyes widened as she righted herself in the air. Landing on her feet, she was given no time to reset herself, because her student was upon her again. Hinata's heart beat heavily against her ribcage. She was giving everything she had, pushing herself beyond her normal limits in order to do as well as she was. Normally she wouldn't have even landed a hit on her sensei, but today she felt as if she could do anything. When she noticed her teacher righting herself in midair, Hinata took off in another sprint, making sure that when Kurenai landed she'd be there to meet her. Opting for a different approach this time, Hinata dropped to the ground and attempted to sweep her sensei's legs out from under her. It failed though because Kurenai jumped back to avoid it, giving her enough time to yell, "Stop." Hinata lifted herself off the ground and used the reprieve to take deep breaths, trying her best to calm her rapidly beating heart. What none of them noticed were a pair of cobalt eyes zeroed in on the young Hyuga. After a few more hours of chakra exercises, some more light sparring, and practicing team strategies, Kurenai realized that there was nothing left she could use to keep Hinata from meeting with Naruto. "Alright team, training's over for the day. We're going to be taking a mission tomorrow. I've already spoken with Lady Tsunade about giving us an out-of-the-village, C-rank mission." Hearing this bit of news caused her female student's eyes to widen. But Kurenai-sensei, you and I just got B back from one of those. Wouldn't it make more sense for us to take some D-rank missions for a while? Kurenai raised an eyebrow at this. In truth, Kurenai had asked for such a mission after deciding that she wanted to keep as much distance as possible between her student and the new Naruto. While that is technically true, our last mission wasn't really what I would call a real mission, more like a trip. This mission that we're going on is a bandit extraction. You three are going to be performing your first kills. Her last statement caused all three young ninjas' eyes to widen. While they each knew that the day would come where they would have to kill, they were unprepared for it to be so soon. Before any of you speak out, let me tell you. I believe that each of you are capable of taking a life. Hinata was shaking on the inside. She feared not only taking a life, but she also feared messing up and coming home to a disappointed Naruto telling her how useless she was. After saying another goodbye, and sending her gentle student a reassuring look, Kurenai left in a swirl of leaves. Kiba and Shino, both still shocked to silence by the news, just left without saying goodbye. Hinata, who was staying behind to wait for Naruto, sunk to her knees and held herself. She tried to pull herself together, not wanting to have her Naruto-kun find her in such a weak state, But she just continued to shiver, eyes wide and glazed over. She was so deep in her thoughts, she didn't realize she was no longer alone until she felt a hand cup her face and she was staring into a set of gentle, cobalt blue eyes. Hinata, hey, what's wrong? Hey, come on, it's me, Naruto. I had something I wanted to talk to you about, remember? Naruto had left the training ground like he said, but the blonde had returned shortly after when he knew everyone would be occupied with training, and wouldn't have noticed him. He watched as his little pet project dominated her two teammates, swiftly defeating them as if they were children. Then, he had a front row seat as Hinata gave her Junin-sensei a run for her money. That, coupled with the girl's budding knowledge of medicine, and Hinata was proving that she would become a very useful addition to his army. When he heard about their mission, Naruto ground his teeth in anger. He knew immediately that Kurenai's plan was to separate the two of them. She was trying to block all of Naruto's advances. But that anger was swiftly pushed aside when he saw his perfect tool begin to break down. Knowing that he was what she needed right now, Naruto came out of his tree and walked over to her. Hinata slowly came back to reality. First thing she noticed were a set of eyes. Eyes that belonged to her Naruto-kun. Suddenly, Hinata couldn't hold it in anymore and she began to cry. She laid her head on his shoulder and let the tears flow down her cheeks. While she didn't wish to appear weak, Hinata knew she wouldn't be able to make it through their discussion without breaking down. So, she cried into her love's shoulder, gasping when she felt Naruto put his arms around her and cradled the young heiress in his lap. It was in this position the two of them stayed in for over a half hour. When Hinata's tears finally subsided, she pulled away from Naruto, and sat on her knees in front of him. I am sorry about that, Naruto-kun. I didn't mean to fall apart on you like that. It's just, I'm afraid of messing up on my next mission. Kurenai Sensei W wants me to kill, and I'm not sure if I can. Naruto nodded in understanding, his mind already figuring out how to turn this into something useful, when he suddenly had an idea. Hinata, don't even worry about it, I know you'll do just fine. You may not be able to see it, but I can see that you have the resolve to kill. I understand that it'll be hard, but I want you to know that when you come back, I'll personally be here to help you through your trauma. Hinata felt her heart skip a beat at her Naruto-kun's words. Knowing that he was willing to be there for her in such a delicate time made her believe that Naruto really did care. Thank you, Naruto-kun. Kurenai didn't say anything other than, I know you three will be able to handle this, and then just left while giving me this pitying look, as if she already anticipated my failure. Listen, Hinata, if you don't feel up to having out talk, I'll understand. You've just gone through a very rough time and I don't want to push you past your limits. Our conversation can. No, it's okay, I'm fine. Please, don't worry about what just happened, I'm sure what you wanted to talk about is important. Naruto had to hold back his smirk at hearing Hinata's words. He knew that she'd want to still have the talk just to spend more time with him. He decided he could trust her with what he'd learned. Okay, Hinata, what I wanted to talk to you about was what I discovered in Wave Country.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.